Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the roar of the ocean filled Erik Thorsson's ears as consciousness slowly returned to him. His eyes fluttered open, immediately squinting against the harsh sunlight beating down upon his face. The warmth was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a far cry from the cool, crisp air of his homeland. As his senses sharpened, Erik became acutely aware of the gritty sand beneath his body and the salt-laden breeze caressing his skin. With a groan, he pushed himself up onto his elbows, his heart pounding wildly in his chest as he took in the unfamiliar landscape before him. Gone were the fjords and snow-capped mountains of his native Norway. Instead, he found himself on a vast expanse of white sand, stretching as far as the eye could see in both directions. The sea before him was a brilliant turquoise, nothing like the steely gray waters he was accustomed to navigating. Odin's beard, Erik muttered, his voice hoarse. What sorcery is this? As he struggled to his feet, the full extent of his situation became clear. Scattered around him were the splintered remains of his once proud longship. Planks of oak, torn sailcloth, and broken oars littered the beach. The sight of his destroyed vessel sent a pang of anguish through Erik's heart. "My ship," he whispered, reaching out to touch a piece of the shattered hull. "My loyal crew. Where are you?" Erik's eyes scanned the shoreline, searching desperately for any sign of his fellow Vikings. But he was alone, save for the wreckage and the strange new world that surrounded him. As he took in his surroundings, Erik's confusion only deepened. In the distance, he could see towering structures unlike anything he had ever encountered. They seemed to scrape the very sky, their surfaces glinting in the sunlight like polished metal. Closer to the shore, smaller buildings in vibrant colors dotted the landscape. What manner of place is this? Erik wondered aloud, his hand instinctively reaching for the axe at his belt. To his dismay, he found the weapon missing, likely lost in the shipwreck. His attention was drawn to movement further down the beach. People, dozens of them, were sprawled on the sand or frolicking in the waves. Their attire was bizarre to Erik's eyes. The men wore little more than brightly colored undergarments, while the women's state of undress would have been considered scandalous in his homeland. Cautiously, Erik approached a nearby group, his warrior's instincts on high alert despite his disorientation. As he drew closer, the beachgoers turned to look at him, their eyes widening in surprise. "Hail, friends," Erik called out in his native Norse. "I am Erik Thorsson of the Vestfold clan. My ship has been wrecked, and I find myself in strange lands. Can you offer aid?" The group stared at him blankly, then began to chatter amongst themselves in a language Erik couldn't comprehend. Their words were rapid and unfamiliar, nothing like the dialects he had encountered on his many raids and trading expeditions. A young woman in the group pulled out a small flat object and held it up towards Erik. It emitted a bright flash, causing him to stumble backward in alarm. "Witchcraft," he exclaimed, raising his arms defensively. The group's chatter grew louder, and some began to laugh, further confusing and frustrating the displaced Viking. Realizing he would find no help here, Erik turned and began to make his way up the beach, towards the strange structures he had seen earlier. Perhaps there, he thought, he might find someone who could understand him, or at least offer some explanation for his current predicament. As he approached what appeared to be a path of smooth black stone, Erik was startled by a deafening roar. A massive, gleaming beast of metal came hurtling towards him at an impossible speed. Erik's battle-honed reflexes kicked in, and he dove to the side, narrowly avoiding being struck by the speeding car. "By Thor's hammer!" he shouted, rolling to his feet and watching in disbelief as the metal beast continued down the path, carrying people within its belly. More of these contraptions followed, each one as fast and loud as the last. Eric's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Never in all his years of exploring and raiding had he encountered such fearsome technology. For the first time since awakening on this strange shore, true fear began to creep into his heart. Determined to find answers, Eric cautiously made his way along the side of the black stone path, his eyes darting warily from one metal beast to another. As he walked, he encountered more people, all dressed in the same bizarre fashion as those on the beach. He attempted to communicate with several passers-by, but each time was met with confused looks or hurried steps to avoid him. "Can no one understand me?" Eric cried out in frustration, his voice rising above the din of the metal beasts and the chatter of the crowds. "Where am I? What is this place?" His pleas went unanswered, the foreign words washing over him like waves upon the shore. Eric felt a growing sense of isolation and despair. He was a stranger in a strange land, unable to communicate, without weapons or allies. For a man who had always prided himself on his strength and adaptability, this helplessness was almost unbearable. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape, Eric found himself wandering aimlessly along the shoreline once more. His mind raced with questions and theories, each more outlandish than the last. Had he died, and this was some bizarre afterlife? Had the gods cursed him for some unknown transgression? Or had he simply lost his mind? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Eric noticed a figure approaching him with purposeful strides. It was a woman, her dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing strange blue trousers and a white covering on her upper body. Unlike the others he had encountered, her expression was one of concern rather than fear or amusement. As she drew closer, Eric could see the kindness in her eyes. She spoke, her words as incomprehensible as all the others he had heard that day, but her tone was gentle and soothing. I don't understand," Eric said, the defeat evident in his voice. The woman tilted her head, studying him intently. Then, to Eric's surprise, she placed a hand on her chest and spoke slowly. "Maria," she said clearly. "Maria Rodriguez." Eric's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope. Finally, someone was trying to communicate with him. He mimicked her gesture, placing his hand on his own chest. "Eric," he replied. "Eric Thorson." Maria smiled warmly and nodded, then gestured for Eric to follow her. For a moment he hesitated, years of caution and suspicion warring with his desperate need for help and understanding. In the end, the kindness in Maria's eyes won out. With a deep breath, Eric nodded and fell into step beside her, his first tenuous connection in this bewildering new world. As they walked away from the beach and towards the towering structures beyond, Eric felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. He didn't know where he was or how he had come to be here, but in Maria he sensed an ally. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as he always had, with courage, strength, and now perhaps a friend. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. As darkness fell over the strange land, Eric Thorson, displaced Viking warrior, took his first steps into a world beyond his wildest imagining, guided by the gentle hand of Dr. Maria Rodriguez. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the Miami Beach skyline in hues of gold and pink, Dr. Maria Rodriguez led Eric Thorson from the small beachside motel, where she had managed to secure him a room for the night. The Viking warrior's eyes were wide with a mixture of wonder and apprehension as he took in the bustling streets before him. "Miami," Eric repeated slowly, testing the foreign word on his tongue. He had picked up a few words from Maria during their brief interactions the previous evening, but the vast majority of this new world remained a mystery to him. Maria nodded encouragingly. "Yes, Miami Beach. This is where you are now, Eric." She spoke slowly, gesturing to their surroundings as they walked. The streets were already alive with activity. Joggers in brightly colored spandex zipped past them, their ears plugged with small white devices. Cars of all shapes and sizes crawled along the road, their engines humming and horns occasionally blaring. Street vendors were setting up their carts. the aroma of unfamiliar foods wafting through the air. Eric's head swiveled from side to side, trying to take in everything at once. His eyes widened as a group of rollerbladers whizzed by, their smooth gliding motion unlike anything he had ever seen. "What manner of shoes are those?" he asked in Norse, forgetting for a moment that Maria couldn't understand him. When she looked at him quizzically, he pointed at the rollerbladers. Maria smiled, understanding his curiosity. "Rollerblades," she said, miming the rolling motion with her hands. As they continued their walk, Maria pointed out various landmarks and modern conveniences, trying her best to explain them in simple terms or through gestures. Eric nodded along, his brow furrowed in concentration as he attempted to make sense of it all. They passed a construction site where a massive crane was lifting steel beams high into the air. Eric stopped in his tracks, his mouth agape as he watched the mechanical giant at work. "By Odin's wisdom," he muttered, "what sorcery allows such a feat?" Maria, noticing his amazement, patted his arm gently. "Technology," she said, tapping her head to indicate knowledge or intelligence. "Human innovation." As they turned onto Ocean Drive, the iconic Art Deco buildings came into view, their pastel colors and neon signs a stark contrast to the rustic wooden structures of Eric's homeland. The warrior's eyes darted from one building to another, trying to comprehend the architectural marvels before him. Suddenly, a sleek sports car roared past them, its engine revving loudly. Eric instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there, his body tensing for battle. Maria quickly placed a calming hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said soothingly. "Just a car, remember? Like last night." Eric relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained wary. The constant noise, the unfamiliar smells, the sheer number of people and strange contraptions. It was all becoming too much. He felt his chest tightening, his breathing becoming more rapid. Maria, noticing his distress, guided him to a nearby bench overlooking the beach. As they sat down, Eric's gaze was drawn to the ocean, the one familiar sight in this alien landscape. He closed his eyes, taking deep breaths as he listened to the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. In his mind's eye, Eric saw the fjords of his homeland, the towering cliffs, the crisp, clean air, the simple life he had known. A wave of homesickness washed over him, so powerful it was almost physical pain. "Heimer," he whispered, the old Norse word for home falling from his lips like a prayer. Maria watched him, her heart aching at the obvious distress on his face. She had spent the night poring over history books and Norse mythology, trying to make sense of the strange man who had appeared on her beach. His clothing, his language, his complete bewilderment at modern technology. It all pointed to something impossible, something she, as a scientist, was struggling to accept. "Eric," she said gently, drawing his attention back to her. "Are you okay?" He met her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and determination. "I not understand," he said haltingly, using one of the few English phrases he had picked up. "All too much." Maria nodded sympathetically. "I know. It's overwhelming. But you're safe here, I promise." As they sat there, Maria attempted to engage Eric in simple conversation, pointing out objects and saying their names in English, which he would then repeat. Slowly, his tension began to ease, his natural curiosity reasserting itself. Their peaceful moment was suddenly shattered by a commotion nearby. A man in a hoodie was sprinting down the sidewalk, clutching a purse to his chest. Close behind him, a woman was giving chase, screaming, "Stop! Thief!" Before Maria could even process what was happening, Eric was on his feet. With a speed and agility that belied his size, he intercepted the thief's path. The purse snatcher, caught off guard, tried to dodge around Eric, but the Viking warrior's reflexes were too quick. In one fluid motion, Eric grabbed the man's arm, using the thief's own momentum to flip him onto his back. The purse went flying, and Eric caught it mid-air with his free hand, all while keeping the would-be thief pinned to the ground with the other. "Nightinger," Eric growled, the old Norse word for villain dripping with contempt. By now, a crowd had gathered, murmuring in awe at the display of strength and skill. The woman whose purse had been stolen rushed up, breathless. "Oh my God, thank you!" she exclaimed, taking her purse from Eric's outstretched hand. Maria, who had been frozen in shock, finally sprang into action. She quickly explained the situation to a nearby police officer who had arrived on the scene. As the officer took the thief into custody, Maria turned to Eric, her eyes wide with amazement. "Eric, that was incredible," she said, her scientific mind racing to reconcile the feat of strength and skill she had just witnessed with the confused, overwhelmed man she had been comforting moments before. Eric, for his part, seemed almost surprised by his own actions. He flexed his hands, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since arriving in this strange new world, he felt a sense of familiarity, the rush of adrenaline, the satisfaction of victory, the gratitude of those he had protected. These, at least, were constants across time and culture. As the excitement died down and the crowd dispersed, Maria led Eric away from the scene. Her mind was whirling with questions. The strength and fighting technique Eric had displayed were not those of a simple modern-day enthusiast playing at being a Viking. They spoke of years of training and real combat experience. "Eric," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "where exactly are you from? When are you from?" Eric looked at her, sensing the weight behind her questions. He pointed out to sea, in the general direction of northwest. "Nordvager," he said. "Norway. Many." He struggled for the word, then held his hands far apart to indicate a great distance. "Many time ago." Maria's scientific skepticism warred with the evidence before her eyes. It was impossible, and yet, she made a decision then, one that would change both their lives forever. "Come with me," she said, taking Eric's hand. "I think it's time we figure out exactly who you are and how you got here." As they walked away from the beach and towards Maria's research facility, Eric felt a mix of emotions. Relief at finding someone who seemed willing to help him, anxiety about the unknown challenges ahead, and a spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he might find a way to understand this new world, or even return to his own. The sun climbed higher in the Miami sky, casting its warm glow over the odd pair. A Viking warrior out of time, and a modern scientist on the verge of a discovery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world. Together they stepped into an uncertain future, the first chapter of their shared adventure coming to a close as a new one began. The fluorescent lights of Maria's laboratory cast a harsh glow over Eric's face as he sat on the examination table, his frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw. For the past week he had been trying to explain his true identity to Maria, but her skepticism was wearing on his patience. "I tell you again," Eric said, his English improving but still heavily accented. "I am Eric Thorson, son of Thor Eriksson of the Vestfold clan. I was born in the year 952 by your Christian calendar. I am a Viking warrior, not a, what did you call it, cosplayer?" Maria sighed, running a hand through her dark hair. "Eric, I understand that you believe this, but you have to see how impossible it sounds. Time travel isn't real. It's science fiction." Eric's fist clenched at his side. "You think I lie? That I do not know my own life? I have sailed the seas, raided distant shores, feasted in the great halls of Jarls. How can I prove to you who I am?" Maria's scientific mind wrestled with the evidence before her. Eric's knowledge of Old Norse was impeccable, his fighting skills extraordinary, and his bewilderment at modern technology genuine. Yet the idea of a time-traveling Viking was simply too fantastical to accept. "I don't think you're lying, Eric," she said gently. "I think you believe what you're saying, but there has to be another explanation. Maybe you suffered a head injury that's affecting your memory." Eric stood up abruptly, towering over Maria. "I am not addled in the mind. I know who I am, where I come from. It is this world that makes no sense." As Eric's voice rose, Maria instinctively took a step back. She saw the hurt and anger in his eyes, and despite her skepticism, she felt a pang of guilt. Over the past week, she had grown fond of the strange, out-of-place man. His kindness, his curiosity about the world, and yes, his rugged good looks, had all combined to create a growing affection that she was struggling to reconcile with her scientific doubts. "I'm sorry, Eric," she said softly. "I didn't mean to upset you. Let's take a break from this for now. Why don't you go for a walk while I review some of your test results?" Eric's shoulders slumped, the fight going out of him. He nodded silently and left the lab, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts and her data. As soon as Eric was gone, Maria turned to her computer, pulling up the results of the various tests she had been secretly conducting on Eric's physiology. Blood work, DNA analysis, brain scans, all of it painted a picture that defied explanation. "This can't be right," she muttered to herself, staring at the screen. Eric's DNA showed markers that were incredibly rare in modern populations, consistent with ancient Norse genetics. His blood work revealed an immune system that had never been exposed to modern diseases or vaccinations. And his brain scans, they were unlike anything she had ever seen. Maria's scientific training told her there had to be a logical explanation, but her heart was beginning to wonder if Eric's impossible story might actually be true. Meanwhile, Eric found himself wandering down to the beach, drawn to the familiar sight and sound of the ocean. As he stood at the water's edge, letting the waves wash over his feet, a deep loneliness engulfed him. He missed his people, his fellow Vikings. He longed for the camaraderie of his warrior brothers, the sound of Norse being spoken around him, the simple pleasures of mead and song in the great halls. Here, in this strange future world, he was utterly alone. Eric waded deeper into the water, feeling a connection to his past through the timeless sea. He dove beneath the waves, swimming with powerful strokes, losing himself in the familiar embrace of the ocean. For a few brief moments, he could almost imagine he was back in the fjords of Norway, preparing for another voyage. As he emerged from the water and made his way back to the shore, Eric noticed a group of Maria's colleagues watching him from the beach. Their whispers and pointed looks made it clear that they were discussing him. Eric's warrior instincts, honed by years of reading potential enemies, told him that these people were suspicious and potentially hostile. Back in the lab, Maria was so engrossed in her analysis that she didn't hear the door open behind her. It wasn't until a voice spoke that she realized she wasn't alone. "Dr. Rodriguez, what exactly are you working on?" Maria spun around to see Dr. Thompson, the head of her department, standing in the doorway with a stern expression. "Dr. Thompson, I'm just reviewing some personal research," Maria stammered, quickly minimizing the windows on her computer screen. Dr. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Personal research? Is this related to that strange man you've been seen with? The one in the ridiculous Viking costume?" Maria felt a flush creep up her neck. "Eric is a subject I'm studying. It's a complex case, but I assure you it's all above board." "Is it?" Dr. Thompson asked, his tone skeptical. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're using university resources for unauthorized research, not to mention the potential ethical violations of studying a subject without proper protocols in place." Maria's heart raced. She knew she had bent some rules in her eagerness to understand Eric's situation, but hearing it laid out like this made her realize how precarious her position had become. "I can explain everything," she began, but Dr. Thompson held up a hand to silence her. "I expect a full report on my desk by Monday morning," he said, "and this Eric person is not to set foot in this lab again until we've reviewed the situation. Is that clear?" Maria nodded mutely, watching as Dr. Thompson left the lab. As soon as he was gone, she slumped into her chair, her mind reeling. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? As the sun began to set, Eric made his way back to the small apartment Maria had arranged for him. As he approached the building, something caught his eye in a store window across the street. He crossed over to take a closer look and felt his world tilt on its axis. There, in the window of an antique shop, was a Viking artifact. a bracelet that looked eerily similar to one he had owned, but it was the description card next to it that made his blood run cold. 10th century Norse arm ring, circa 975 AD. Eric staggered back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was proof, undeniable proof, that he had indeed traveled through time. The bracelet was not just similar to his, it was his. He recognized the unique patterns he had carved into it himself. As the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him, Eric felt a mix of vindication and terror. He had been telling the truth all along, but the truth was far more frightening than any lie could have been. He was truly lost in time, over 1,000 years from everything and everyone he had ever known. With shaking hands, Eric pulled out the cell phone Maria had given him and dialed her number. When she answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Maria," he said, "I need you to come. I have found proof. You must see this." As he waited for Maria to arrive, Eric stared at the bracelet in the window, a tangible link to his past that now seemed impossibly distant. He knew that once Maria saw this, everything would change. The night was restless for Eric Thorson. As he tossed and turned in his bed, his mind was besieged by vivid dreams of his past life. The salty spray of the sea on his face as his longship cut through the waves, the clash of steel against steel in battle, the warmth of the Great Hall's fire as he shared mead with his fellow warriors. All these memories swirled in his subconscious, feeling as real as the modern world he now inhabited. In his dream, Eric found himself standing on the prow of his ship, the wind whipping through his hair as they approached a foreign shore. But as they drew closer, the coastline began to shift and change, transforming into the familiar skyline of Miami Beach. The warriors around him morphed into modern beachgoers, their swords and axes replaced by smartphones and sunglasses. Eric jolted awake, his heart racing and his body covered in a cold sweat. He sat up, disoriented, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. It took him a moment to remember where he was. The small apartment Maria had arranged for him. "Odin, give me strength," he muttered, running a hand over his face. These dreams had been occurring with increasing frequency, leaving him feeling torn between two worlds belonging to neither. As the sun began to rise, Eric made his way to the beach, seeking solace in the familiar embrace of the ocean. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Maria approaching until she called out to him. "Eric, you're up early," she said, joining him at the water's edge. He turned to her, the weariness evident in his eyes. "Sleep brings no rest, only echoes of a life I fear I may never see again." Maria's heart ached at the pain in his voice. Over the past weeks, since the discovery of Eric's bracelet in the antique shop, she had come to accept the impossible truth of his origin. Her skepticism had given way to a deep compassion for this man out of time. "Tell me about your dreams," she said gently, sitting down on the sand and motioning for him to join her. Eric sighed, lowering himself beside her. "They are vivid, Maria, so real I can taste the salt on my lips, feel the weight of my axe in my hand. But then it all changes. The past and present blur together, and I am lost between them." Maria listened intently, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on Eric's arm in a gesture of comfort. It must be incredibly difficult, reconciling these two worlds. Eric nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I am a warrior, Maria. I know my place in battle, on the sea. But here I am adrift." "You're adapting remarkably well," Maria assured him. "And your knowledge, your skills, they're invaluable. In fact, I was hoping you might be willing to help us with something today." Eric's interest was piqued. "What kind of help?" Maria explained that her marine biology team was planning a rescue mission for a pod of dolphins trapped in a nearby cove. The operation was risky, requiring skilled swimmers and strong arms to guide the animals to safety. "Your strength and your comfort in the water could be a great asset," she finished. For the first time that morning, a smile crossed Eric's face. To aid in a rescue? It would be an honor. Hours later, Eric found himself on a boat with Maria and her team, approaching the cove where the dolphins were trapped. As they neared, he could hear the distressed calls of the animals echoing across the water. "Remember the plan," Maria called out as they prepared to enter the water. "Guide them gently, don't force them. Eric, stay close to me." Eric nodded, his warrior focus settling over him like a familiar cloak. As he dove into the water, his powerful strokes quickly brought him alongside the first dolphin. With gentle but firm hands, he began to guide the animal towards the open sea. The rescue was arduous, and not without danger. At one point, a panicked dolphin's tail caught one of Maria's colleagues in the chest, sending him spinning through the water. Without hesitation, Eric swam to the man's aid, supporting him and bringing him safely back to the boat. As the last dolphin was guided to freedom, a cheer went up from the team. Eric emerged from the water exhilarated. For the first time since arriving in this strange future, he felt truly useful, his skills put to a noble purpose. Maria beamed at him as they headed back to shore. "That was incredible, Eric. You were amazing out there." Eric felt a warmth in his chest at her praise, but his smile faltered as he noticed something on the dock as they approached. Two men in dark suits were watching their boat intently, their gaze fixed specifically on Eric and Maria. "Maria," he said in a low voice, "those men on the dock, do you know them?" Maria followed his gaze, her brow furrowing. "No, I don't recognize them. Why?" "They watch us too closely," Eric muttered, his warrior instincts on high alert. "I do not like it." As they disembarked, Eric kept a wary eye on the strangers, positioning himself protectively near Maria. The men made no move to approach, but Eric could feel their eyes following them as they left the marina. "Perhaps it's nothing," Maria said, trying to sound reassuring. "But let's be careful, just in case." Over the next few days, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He noticed the same car parked on their street multiple times, and once, he was sure he spotted one of the men from the dock following them at a distance in a crowded market. "We must be cautious, Maria," he warned her. "In my time, such scrutiny often preceded an attack." Maria nodded, her own concern growing. "I'll alert campus security just to be safe. But Eric, there's something else I need to show you." She led him to her lab, checking carefully to ensure they weren't followed. Once inside, she pulled up a series of complex diagrams on her computer screen. "This is your DNA analysis," she explained. "I've been studying it intensively, and Eric, it's unlike anything I've ever seen." Eric leaned in, trying to make sense of the images before him. "What does it mean?" Maria took a deep breath. "Your genetic structure shows markers that are incredibly rare, some that we've only theorized about. It's as if your DNA has been altered by your journey through time." Eric's eyes widened. "Altered? How?" "I'm not entirely sure," Maria admitted. "But it seems to have enhanced certain aspects of your physiology. Your strength, your reflexes, your ability to heal. They're all far beyond what we'd consider normal human limits." Eric sat heavily in a nearby chair, his mind reeling. "So I am changed? No longer fully human?" Maria quickly moved to reassure him. "You're still you, Eric. This doesn't change who you are. But it might explain why those men are so interested in you, if they've somehow learned about your unique situation." She left the thought unfinished, but Eric understood the implication. His very existence was a scientific miracle, one that unscrupulous individuals might seek to exploit. As they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their situation settled over them. Eric, a man out of time, now found himself not only struggling to reconcile his past with his present, but also grappling with the knowledge that his very DNA had been altered by his impossible journey. Maria, for her part, felt the full weight of her responsibility. She had uncovered a scientific breakthrough that could change the world. But at what cost to Eric's safety and freedom? As the sun set outside the lab window, casting long shadows across the room, Eric and Maria shared a look of determination. The sun had barely risen over Miami Beach when Eric spotted them again. Two men in dark suits, their faces expressionless, watching from across the street as he and Maria left her apartment. It was the same pair they'd seen at the marina, the ones who had been following them for days. Eric's hand instinctively went to his side, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. As he studied their pursuers more closely, something about their bearing, their watchfulness, struck a familiar chord. It was a realization that sent a chill down his spine. "Maria," he whispered urgently. "Those men, they move like warriors from my time." Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Eric, that's impossible. They can't be." "Not impossible." Eric cut her off. "No more impossible than my presence here. Look at how they stand, how they observe. These are not men of your time." As if sensing they'd been made, the two suited men began to move towards them with purposeful strides. Eric grabbed Maria's hand. "We must go. Now." They took off running down the busy street, weaving through the morning crowd of joggers and early risers. Eric's Viking reflexes served him well, allowing him to navigate the urban terrain with surprising agility. Maria struggled to keep up, her breath coming in short gasps. "Eric," she panted as they ducked into an alley. "If what you're saying is true, if they're really from your time, what do they want?" Eric's face was grim. "Nothing good, I fear. In my time, rival clans would often seek to eliminate powerful enemies. If they followed me here..." He didn't need to finish the thought. Maria's determination solidified in that moment. This wasn't just about protecting a scientific anomaly anymore. It was about safeguarding someone she had come to care for deeply. "We won't let them hurt you," she declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Whatever it takes, we'll keep you safe." Eric felt a surge of affection for this brave, modern woman. "Thank you, Maria. But if we are to face this threat, you must be prepared. I will teach you to fight as my people do." Over the next few days, as they moved from safe house to safe house, Eric began Maria's combat training. In quiet moments between watching for their pursuers, he showed her the basics of Viking hand-to-hand combat. "Your modern fighting styles rely too much on rules," Eric explained as they practiced in a secluded park. "Viking combat is about survival. Use everything at your disposal." Maria grunted as she tried to replicate a move Eric had shown her. "Everything except battle axes and broadswords, you mean?" Eric chuckled, a rare sound that made Maria's heart skip. "For now, yes. But you'd be surprised how effective everyday objects can be as weapons." As the days passed, Maria's skills improved rapidly. Eric couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he watched her master techniques that had taken him years to perfect. "You would have made a fine shield maiden," he told her one evening, his voice warm with admiration. Maria blushed at the compliment, but before she could respond, the sound of screeching tires shattered the moment. Their pursuers had found them again. "To the marina!" Eric shouted, already running. "We'll lose them on the water!" They sprinted through the darkening streets, the sound of heavy footsteps never far behind. As they reached the docks, Eric quickly untied a speedboat, thanking the gods that Maria had insisted on teaching him the basics of modern watercraft. Just as they roared away from the dock, their pursuers emerged from the shadows, commandeering another boat to give chase. "Hold on!" Eric yelled over the engine's roar as he opened the throttle fully. The boat leaped forward, skimming over the waves as they raced out into the open water. Maria clung to her seat, her knuckles white. "Eric, they're gaining on us." Eric glanced back, seeing the other boat closing the distance. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. Then he spotted it, a narrow channel between two small islands ahead. "Maria, when I say so, lean left as hard as you can." As they approached the channel, Eric waited until the last possible moment. "Now!" They both threw their weight to the left, and the boat banked sharply, sliding sideways through the narrow gap. Their pursuers, caught off guard by the maneuver, had to veer off to avoid crashing. Eric allowed himself a grim smile of satisfaction as he guided their boat into a hidden cove, cutting the engine and listening intently. The sound of the other boat faded into the distance. I think we lost them, Maria whispered, her voice shaky with adrenaline. But as they turned to head back to shore, a figure stepped out from behind a cluster of mangroves. Eric tensed, ready for a fight, but froze when he saw the man's face. Bjorn? He gasped, recognizing a fellow Viking from his own time. The man nodded solemnly. Aye, Eric Thorson. It's been a long time, or perhaps no time at all, depending on how you look at it. Maria looked between the two men, confusion clear on her face. Eric, who is this? Eric's mind was reeling. This is Bjorn Ironside, a warrior from my clan. But how are you here? Bjorn's laugh was without humor. The same way you are, my friend. Thrown across time by forces we don't understand. But unlike you, I've learned to control it. Eric's heart raced at the implications. You know how to return? To our time? Bjorn nodded slowly. I do. And I can show you the way home, Eric. But first, we need to talk. There's much you don't understand about what's happening. As Bjorn spoke, Eric felt his world tilting on its axis once again. The possibility of returning home, which had seemed like an impossible dream, was suddenly within reach. But as he glanced at Maria, he felt a conflicting pull. The future, this future, had become more than just a strange land to him. It had become a place where he had found a new purpose, and perhaps even a new home. Very well, Eric said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Let us talk, but know this, Bjorn. Much has changed since we last met. My loyalties are not what they once were. Bjorn's eyes flicked to Maria, a knowing look crossing his face. So I see. Come then, both of you. We have much to discuss, and little time. The others will not give up their hunt so easily. As they followed Bjorn into the gathering darkness, Eric felt the weight of his two worlds pressing down upon him. The past and the future, colliding in ways he could never have imagined. Whatever revelations awaited him, he knew that the choices he would soon face would change the course of his life, and perhaps the course of history itself. Maria squeezed his hand reassuringly, a gesture that spoke volumes. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Viking and scientist, past and present, united against the tides of time itself. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the walls of Bjorn's hidden sanctuary, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Eric's heart. He sat at a rough-hewn table, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of mead, a taste of home that now felt both comforting and alien. Across from him, Bjorn leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. You understand now, don't you, Eric? The power we've stumbled upon, it's beyond anything our people could have imagined. We can shape the very fabric of time itself. Eric nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from everything Bjorn had revealed. The existence of a secret society of time travelers, the dangers they faced, the responsibility they bore. It was almost too much to comprehend. And you say you can send me back? Back to our time? Eric asked, unable to keep the longing from his voice. Bjorn's eyes glinted in the candlelight. Aye, I can. But the question is, do you truly want to go back? Eric's gaze involuntarily flicked to where Maria stood by the window, her silhouette outlined against the Miami skyline. In the weeks since they'd met Bjorn, as they'd delved deeper into the mysteries of time travel, Eric had found his feelings for Maria growing stronger with each passing day. As if sensing his gaze, Maria turned, offering him a small, sad smile. The depth of emotion in her eyes made Eric's heart clench. I don't know, Eric admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Bjorn leaned back, a knowing look on his face. Ah, the age-old dilemma. The pull of home versus the tug of the heart. Tell me, Eric, what does your warrior's instinct tell you? Before Eric could respond, Maria approached the table. I think I've made a breakthrough in understanding the mechanism behind your time travel, she said, her excitement evident despite the tension in the room. She spread out a series of complex diagrams and equations. Look here, she pointed. I believe the temporal displacement is triggered by a specific combination of electromagnetic fields and quantum fluctuations. If we could replicate these conditions... Eric tried to follow her explanation, but his mind kept wandering. He found himself captivated not by the science, but by the passion in Maria's voice, the light in her eyes as she unraveled the mysteries of the universe. Bjorn, however, was leaning forward with keen interest. "Impressive," he murmured. "You've come closer to understanding our abilities than any other outsider I've encountered." Maria beamed at the praise, but Eric felt a sudden chill. The way Bjorn said "outsider" set off warning bells in his mind. As if reading his thoughts, Bjorn turned to Eric. "You see now why this knowledge must be protected? In the wrong hands, it could unravel the very fabric of reality." Eric nodded slowly, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. Bjorn continued, his voice taking on a persuasive tone. "Eric, old friend, think of what we could accomplish together. We could return to our time armed with knowledge of the future. We could shape the destiny of our people, become legends in our own right." "And what of Maria?" Eric asked, his voice tight. Bjorn's expression hardened. "She cannot come with us, Eric, you know that. The risks of bringing someone from this time back to ours are too great." "Then I won't go," Eric said firmly, reaching for Maria's hand. Bjorn's eyes narrowed. "Think carefully, Eric. I'm offering you a chance to go home to see your family, your clan again. All I ask in return is that you leave the girl behind and ensure her research never sees the light of day." The implications of Bjorn's words hung heavy in the air. Eric felt as if he'd been struck. "You want me to betray her? To destroy her life's work?" Maria gasped, her hand tightening around Eric's. "Eric, you can't..." "Silence," Bjorn snapped, all pretense of friendliness gone. "This is not your decision to make, woman. Eric, think of your duty to your people, to your time. This knowledge in the hands of those not ready for it could spell disaster." Eric stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "My duty," he growled. "My duty is to protect those I care for in any time. I will not betray Maria, nor will I allow you to threaten her." Bjorn's face darkened. "Then you leave me no choice. I had hoped you would see reason, Eric, but if you insist on protecting her and this dangerous knowledge..." He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, glowing device. Before Eric could react, Bjorn activated it, filling the room with a pulsing energy that made Eric's hair stand on end. "No!" Maria cried out, lunging for her research papers. But it was too late. As the energy wave passed over them, the papers burst into flames, crumbling to ash in seconds. Eric roared in anger, launching himself at Bjorn. The two Vikings crashed together in a furious grapple, their strength evenly matched. They tumbled across the room, upending furniture and shattering glassware. Maria scrambled to salvage what she could of her research, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full extent of what she'd lost. Years of work gone in an instant. As Eric and Bjorn continued to battle, Maria noticed the glowing device that had fallen from Bjorn's grasp. Acting on instinct, she grabbed it, quickly examining its intricate design. "Eric," she shouted, "I think I can reverse it." Eric, hearing the urgency in her voice, redoubled his efforts. With a mighty heave, he threw Bjorn across the room, buying himself a moment to turn to Maria. "Do it!" he yelled. Maria's fingers flew over the device, her scientific mind racing to understand its workings. With a silent prayer, she activated it. The room filled once again with pulsing energy, but this time it coalesced around Bjorn. The time traveler's eyes widened in shock and fear as he felt himself being pulled away. "This isn't over, Eric," Bjorn snarled. "You've chosen your side. The consequences will be on your head." With a final flash of light, he vanished. As the energy faded, Eric rushed to Maria's side. She collapsed into his arms, overcome by the events and the loss of her life's work. "I'm so sorry, Maria," Eric murmured, holding her close. "Your research, all your hard work." Maria looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's not just that, Eric. I thought I was going to lose you." when Bjorn offered you the chance to go home? Eric cupped her face gently. Maria, don't you see? You are my home now. This time, this place. It's where I belong. With you. As their lips met in a tender kiss, both Eric and Maria knew that everything had changed. The decision had been made, loyalties declared. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A Viking warrior and a modern scientist, bound by love and united against the tides of time. But as they held each other in the aftermath of the confrontation, neither could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Bjorn's parting words echoed ominously in their minds, a reminder that their fight was far from over. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Eric and Maria stood together, ready to face whatever the future, or the past, might throw their way. Their relationship had been forged in the fires of conflict and choice, emerging stronger than ever. The cool, damp air of the ancient burial mound sent a shiver down Sarah's spine as she carefully made her way through the narrow passage. Her headlamp cast eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls, each flicker of light seeming to bring the ancient carvings to life. She had been exploring these mounds for weeks now, hoping to find some clue that would bring her closer to understanding her connection to this land and its history. As she rounded a corner, her breath caught in her throat. There, partially buried in the earthen floor, was a large, flat stone covered in intricate runic markings. Sarah's heart raced as she knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as she brushed away centuries of dirt and debris. "Ingrid," she called out, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Ingrid, come quick, I found something." Moments later, Ingrid appeared, her own headlamp bobbing in the darkness. "What is it, Sarah? What have you found?" Sarah gestured excitedly to the runestone. "Look at this. It's incredible. I've never seen runes quite like these before." Ingrid crouched beside her, her brow furrowing as she examined the stone. "These are old," she murmured. "Very old. And you're right, some of these symbols are unusual." Sarah pulled out her notebook and began sketching the runes, her hand moving quickly across the page. "We need to get this translated as soon as possible. I have a feeling it's important." Ingrid nodded, but there was a hint of concern in her voice. "Just remember, Sarah, not every stone tells a story. Sometimes a rune stone is just a rune stone." But Sarah barely heard her. She was already lost in the swirling patterns of the runes, her mind racing with possibilities. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into the task of deciphering the runestone's message. She pored over ancient texts, consulted with linguists, and spent countless hours staring at her sketches, willing them to reveal their secrets. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's obsession with the runestone began to take its toll. She barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with vivid visions of Viking longships, gleaming treasures, and a distant island shrouded in mist. One night she jolted awake, her heart pounding. In her dream, she had seen a great hoard of Viking gold hidden away in a cave on a rocky shore. The image had been so clear, so real, that she could almost feel the weight of the gold in her hands. "Ingrid," she said over breakfast the next morning, her eyes bright with excitement. "I think I'm getting close to cracking the code. These runes, they're not just a message. They're a map." Ingrid looked up from her coffee, her expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "A map? To what?" "To a treasure," Sarah replied, spreading out her notes on the table. "Look here. These symbols, when combined with the ancient sagas, point to a specific location, an island off the coast, one that's not on any modern maps." Ingrid leaned in, studying Sarah's work. "That's quite a leap, Sarah. Are you sure you're not seeing what you want to see?" Sarah felt a flare of irritation. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I just mean, well, you've been working on this non-stop for weeks. Maybe you need to take a step back, get some perspective." "Perspective?" Sarah scoffed. "Ingrid, this could be the discovery of a lifetime. Don't you see how important this is?" Ingrid's voice took on a harder edge. Of course I see the potential importance, but I also see you running yourself into the ground over a theory that might not pan out. You've barely slept, you're not eating properly. I'm fine, Sarah snapped. I don't need you to mother me. What I need is your support. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Ingrid stood up slowly, her face a mask of hurt and disappointment. You have my support, Sarah. You've always had it. But I won't stand by and watch you destroy yourself over this obsession. With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Sarah alone with her runestone riddle. As the days wore on, the strain in Sarah and Ingrid's relationship grew. They spoke less and less, the silence between them filled with unspoken words and mounting frustration. But Sarah couldn't let go of her pursuit. She knew, deep in her bones, that she was on the verge of something monumental. And then, on a stormy night when the wind howled outside like the ghosts of long-dead Vikings, Sarah had her breakthrough. She sat bolt upright in bed, her mind suddenly clear. Racing to her desk, she pulled out her notes and began scribbling furiously. The pieces fell into place with astonishing speed. The unusual runes, the references in the sagas, the recurring elements in her dreams. It all pointed to one place. Hrafnsey, she whispered, the unfamiliar name feeling right on her tongue. Raven's Island. With trembling hands, she pulled up a map on her computer, inputting the coordinates she had deciphered. There, in a remote part of the North Sea, was a tiny, unnamed island, exactly where the runestone said it would be. Sarah's heart pounded with anticipation. She had done it. She had solved the runestone's riddle. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Sarah made a decision. She would go to Hrafnsey, with or without Ingrid's blessing. Whatever awaited her on that remote island, be it treasure, truth, or something else entirely, she knew she had to see it through. She began packing immediately, throwing clothes and equipment into a bag. As she worked, she rehearsed what she would say to Ingrid, how she would explain her need to make this journey. But when she emerged from her room, ready to face whatever argument might come, she found Ingrid already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You're going, aren't you?" Ingrid asked softly. Sarah nodded, surprised by the lack of resistance. "I have to, Ingrid. I'm so close to understanding everything." Ingrid sighed, pushing one of the mugs towards Sarah. "I know, and I'm coming with you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You are? But I thought..." "You thought I didn't believe in you," Ingrid finished for her. "But that's not true, Sarah. I've always believed in you. I worry. This means so much to you, and I didn't want to see you hurt if it didn't pan out." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She reached across the table, taking Ingrid's hand in hers. "I'm sorry I've been so obsessed. I know I haven't been easy to live with lately." Ingrid squeezed her hand. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever we find on Hrafnsey, treasure, ruins, or nothing at all, we'll face it side by side." As they sat there, hands clasped over steaming coffee, Sarah felt a wave of excitement wash over her. The runestone's riddle had led her to this moment, to this precipice of discovery. And now, with Ingrid by her side, she was ready to take the leap into the unknown. As his opponent gasped for air, Eric brought the pommel of his sword down hard on the back of his head, sending him crumpling to the floor. For a moment, the warehouse fell silent. Eric stood amidst a circle of fallen foes, his chest heaving with exertion. Blood, both his and others, streaked his arms and face, giving him the appearance of a warrior straight out of legend. "Maria," he panted, turning to her. "What have you found?" Maria looked up from her work, her eyes wide with wonder and a touch of fear. "Eric, this artifact, it's not just a relic, it's a message from the gods themselves." Eric's brow furrowed as he approached, wiping his blade clean on a fallen enemy's cloak. "A message? What does it say?" Before Maria could respond, a slow clap echoed through the warehouse. Both Eric and Maria whirled to face the sound. Eric instinctively placing himself between Maria and the potential threat. From the shadows emerged a tall, imposing figure clad in a long, dark coat. His face was obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking the aura of power that radiated from him. "Well done, Eric Thorson," the figure spoke, his voice deep and resonant. "You fight with the fury of your ancestors. But do you truly understand why you are here?" Eric tightened his grip on his sword. "Who are you? Another time traveler come to meddle in affairs not your own?" The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Maria's spine. "Oh, I am far more than a mere time traveler, young warrior. I am the one who set you on this path. I am the All-Father himself." With a dramatic flourish, the figure threw back his hood, revealing a weathered face adorned with a patch over one eye. Eric's sword clattered to the ground as recognition dawned. "Odin," he breathed, dropping to one knee in reverence. Maria stood frozen, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This is impossible," she muttered. Odin turned his piercing gaze to her. "Ah, the woman of science. Tell me, child, what does your artifact say?" Maria swallowed hard, glancing down at her tablet. It speaks of a great battle. A battle that will shake the foundations of time itself. And it names Eric as the chosen warrior. Eric's head snapped up at this, his eyes wide. "Chosen? For what purpose, All-Father?" Odin strode forward, his presence filling the warehouse. "The battle of which the stone speaks is not one of mere mortal concerns, Eric. It is a battle for the very fabric of reality. The time travelers you have faced are but pawns in a greater game, one that threatens to unravel the threads of fate itself." He placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, and Eric felt a surge of power course through him. "You, my son, have been chosen to stand against this threat. Your journey through time was no accident, but a necessary step to prepare you for what is to come." Eric rose to his feet, a new resolve settling over him. I understand, All-Father. I will not fail you." Maria stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "But how is this possible? Norse gods, time travel, ancient prophecies. It defies everything I know about the world." Odin turned to her, a hint of amusement in his ancient eyes. "Ah, the eternal question of science versus faith. Tell me, Maria, have your eyes not seen wonders beyond explanation these past weeks? Has your mind not been open to possibilities you once thought impossible?" As if in response to his words, the artifact in Maria's hands began to glow with an otherworldly light. Runes etched into its surface blazed to life, casting eerie shadows across the warehouse. Maria gasped as she felt a surge of energy flow through her. In that moment, she saw flashes of other times, other places, Viking longships cutting through mist-shrouded waters, great battles fought beneath strange skies, and glimpses of realms beyond mortal comprehension. When the vision faded, Maria found herself breathless, her worldview irrevocably altered. I see," she whispered, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. Eric moved to her side, his hand finding hers. The touch sent a jolt through both of them, a reminder of the bond that had formed between them through their shared trials. Odin nodded approvingly. "You both have roles to play in the coming battle. Eric, your strength and warrior spirit will be needed. And you, Maria, your mind and your ability to bridge the gap between science and magic will be crucial." He turned, his form seeming to shimmer and fade. "Prepare yourselves. The enemy gathers its forces, and the fate of all realities hangs in the balance. When the time comes, you must be ready to face challenges beyond anything you have yet encountered." As Odin vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense of power, Eric and Maria found themselves alone in the warehouse once more. The bodies of the fallen time travelers had disappeared, leaving no trace of the battle that had just taken place. Eric turned to Maria, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right? I know this must be overwhelming for you." Maria took a deep breath, centering herself. It's a lot to process, certainly, but Eric, I've seen too much to deny what's happening. Whatever this battle is, whatever role we have to play, I'm with you. Eric felt a swell of emotion in his chest. He pulled Maria close, their foreheads touching. Together then. Whatever comes, we face it as one. As they stood there, the weight of their newfound purpose settling over them, both Eric and Maria knew that their lives had changed irrevocably. The echoes of Valhalla rang in their ears, a call to arms that spanned centuries and defied the laws of reality itself. Outside the warehouse, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, as if nature itself sensed the approaching conflict. Eric and Maria stepped out into the growing darkness, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Miami coastline, usually bustling with tourists and locals alike, stood eerily empty as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy, a palpable tension that seemed to hold the very fabric of reality in its grasp. At the water's edge, Eric Thorson stood tall, his eyes fixed on the imposing structure before him, the time traveler's stronghold. Behind him, a motley crew of allies gathered, historians, scientists, and even a few fellow time-displaced individuals who had rallied to their cause. At his side, Maria clutched the artifact they had recovered, its surface pulsing with an ethereal light. Eric raised his sword, forged in this modern time, but imbued with the spirit of his Viking ancestors. His voice, carrying the weight of centuries, rang out across the beach. For the sake of all times, all realities, we fight. With a thunderous roar, Eric charged forward, his allies surging behind him. The battle cry echoed off the surrounding buildings, a sound that bridged the gap between past and present. As they approached the stronghold, its defenses sprang to life. Shimmering energy fields erupted from hidden emitters, and guards armed with weapons far beyond modern understanding poured out to meet the attackers. Eric's sword clashed against energy blades, his centuries-old combat skills adapting to face these futuristic threats. He moved with a fluid grace, each strike precise and devastating. Around him, the battle raged, a chaotic mix of ancient valor and future technology. "Maria," Eric called out between blows. "The portal." Maria nodded, her heart pounding as she raced towards the center of the stronghold. She knew their entire plan hinged on her ability to activate the time portal, to set right the temporal disruptions that threatened to unravel reality itself. As she ran, Maria's mind raced, reviewing the complex calculations and theories she had developed over the past weeks. The artifact in her hands hummed with increasing intensity, as if sensing its proximity to the portal. Reaching the central chamber, Maria gasped at the sight before her. A massive circular structure dominated the room, its surface alive with swirling energies and pulsing lights. This was the nexus of the time traveler's power, the gateway between worlds and eras. Maria set to work immediately, her fingers flying over control panels as she input the necessary codes and adjustments. The artifact's glow intensified, interfacing with the portal's systems in ways that defied conventional science. Come on," Maria muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple as she worked, acutely aware of the sounds of battle drawing ever closer. Meanwhile, Eric fought his way deeper into the stronghold, leaving a trail of subdued opponents in his wake. His muscles burned with exertion, but the fury of battle sang in his veins, driving him forward. As he entered a vast atrium, a slow clap echoed through the space. Eric spun, sword at the ready, to face this new threat. From the shadows emerged a figure that seemed to shimmer and shift, as if not fully anchored in this reality. The leader of the time travelers, a warrior from a future so distant it was barely recognizable as human. "Impressive, Viking," the figure spoke, its voice a discordant mix of tones and timbres. "But your primitive skills are no match for what I've learned across the millennia." The leader raised a hand, and a weapon materialized, a blade of pure energy that crackled and sparked with temporal power. Eric's eyes narrowed. We shall see whose skills prevail, creature." With that, they clashed. The atrium filled with the sound of their combat. The ring of Eric's steel against the hum of the energy blade, the grunts of exertion and cries of pain as blows found their mark. Eric had never faced an opponent like this. The leader moved with inhuman speed and grace, its form sometimes seeming to flicker in and out of existence. But Eric's centuries of combat experience served him well, allowing him to anticipate and counter moves that defied the laws of physics. As they fought, Eric found himself driven back, step by step. The leader's attacks came faster, more furiously, and Eric realized with a sinking heart that he was outmatched. In the portal chamber, Maria's efforts were reaching a crescendo. The artifact's glow had intensified to an almost blinding level, its energies intertwining with those of the portal. Readouts on the control panels fluctuated wildly as the very fabric of space-time buckled and warped around them. "Almost there," Maria whispered, her fingers dancing across the controls. "Just a little more." Suddenly, an alarm blared throughout the stronghold. Maria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. On a nearby screen, she could see Eric's battle with the time traveler leader, and Eric was losing. Maria's heart clenched as she watched Eric stumble, barely deflecting a blow that would have ended the fight. In that moment, she realized the terrible choice that lay before her. The portal was almost ready. With a few more adjustments, she could activate it, sending the displaced individuals back to their proper times and sealing the breach that threatened all of reality. But doing so would mean leaving Eric behind, trapped in this time, or worse, erased from existence entirely. Tears streamed down Maria's face as the full weight of the decision crashed down upon her. Save reality itself, or save the man she had come to love? In the atrium, Eric felt his strength failing. The leader's attacks were relentless, each blow driving Eric further back. As he parried another strike, Eric's foot slipped on the smooth floor. He stumbled, his guard dropping for just a moment. The leader saw its opportunity and struck. The energy blade sliced through the air, aiming straight for Eric's heart. Time seemed to slow. Eric saw the blade approaching, knew he couldn't dodge in time. In that moment, his thoughts turned to Maria, to the future they might have had. But the killing blow never landed. Instead, a blinding flash of light erupted between Eric and the leader, throwing them both backwards. As Eric's vision cleared, he saw Maria standing in the center of the atrium, the artifact held high above her head. Its glow had intensified to an impossible degree, filling the entire stronghold with its otherworldly light. "Maria," Eric called out, "what have you done?" Maria's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "What I had to do," she replied, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of energy. The leader of the time travelers staggered to its feet, its form flickering more violently now. "No," it cried, its voice distorting. "You'll destroy everything." Maria shook her head. "Not destroy, reset." With those words, the artifact's energies exploded outward. Eric felt himself being lifted off his feet, carried by a wave of temporal force. Around him, he could see the very walls of reality bending and warping. As the light engulfed him, Eric reached out desperately towards Maria. Their fingers brushed for just a moment before the tide of time swept them apart. "Maria!" Eric's voice echoed across the ages as he felt himself being pulled back to his own time, his own world. The last thing he saw before the light consumed everything was Maria's face, tears streaming down her cheeks as she mouthed 3 words, "I love you." And then, in a final burst of blinding radiance, the world as they knew it ceased to exist. In the aftermath, as the dust of rewritten timelines settled, the Miami coastline stood peaceful once more. The stronghold had vanished as if it had never existed, and on the beach, 2 figures lay unconscious in the sand, a Viking warrior and a modern scientist, their hands intertwined. As Eric and Maria slowly stirred, their eyes meeting in a gaze of confusion and wonder, they realized that their battle was over. But the true test, navigating a world forever changed by their actions, was only just beginning. The final battle had been fought, reality itself reshaped. And at the heart of it all stood Eric and Maria, their love a beacon that had guided them through the very tides of time. The air crackled with energy as the time portal swirled before them, a mesmerizing vortex of blues and purples that seemed to beckon Eric home. The beach was deserted save for Eric, Maria, and a small group of allies who had gathered to witness this momentous occasion. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore provided a stark contrast to the otherworldly hum emanating from the portal. Eric stood at the edge of the portal, his Viking armor gleaming in the ethereal light. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, a familiar weight that now felt somehow foreign. He turned to face Maria, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. "It calls to me, Maria," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can hear the songs of my people, smell the salt air of my homeland. It's overwhelming." Maria stepped closer, her heart breaking with each word. She reached out, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know, Eric. This is your chance to go back, to return to the life you knew." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, threatening to spill over. She had known this moment would come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality was far more painful than she could have imagined. I want you to know," she began, her voice cracking, "that these past months with you have been the most extraordinary of my life. You've shown me a world beyond science, beyond what I thought was possible." Eric's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped. "And you, Maria, have given me a glimpse of a future I never could have dreamed of. You've challenged me, inspired me, and—" He paused, swallowing hard, "and loved me in a way I never knew was possible." The portal pulsed as if growing impatient. Eric turned to look at it once more, feeling the pull of his past life growing stronger with each passing moment. "I must decide," he said, more to himself than to Maria. Maria nodded, stepping back to give him space. Her heart felt like it was being torn in two, but she knew she had to let him make this choice on his own. Eric closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. In his mind, he saw flashes of his life in the Viking Age, the thrill of battle, the camaraderie of his fellow warriors, the simple joys of a world untouched by modern complexities. But interwoven with these memories were new ones. The wonder of discovering this new world with Maria, the intellectual sparring that had become a cherished part of their relationship, the depth of emotion he had discovered in himself. Opening his eyes, Eric's gaze swept over the assembled group. He saw the hope in their eyes, the belief that his return to the past would somehow set things right. But as his eyes met Maria's, he saw something else, a love so pure and true that it transcended time itself. In that moment, Eric made his decision. With a deep breath, he stepped forward. The assembled group began to back away, fear evident on their faces. Eric stood his ground, placing himself between Maria and the increasingly unstable portal. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice steady, "we face it together." Maria nodded, reaching out to take his hand once more. As their fingers intertwined, a surge of energy seemed to pass between them. Suddenly, the portal exploded in a blinding flash of light. Eric instinctively pulled Maria close, shielding her with his body as waves of temporal energy washed over them. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Eric and Maria were suspended in a sea of swirling light and color. Flashes of different times and places danced before their eyes, ancient battlefields, futuristic cityscapes, and everything in between. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, revealing the beach once more. But it was changed. The modern skyline of Miami in the distance had shifted, blending seamlessly with structures that looked like they belonged in Eric's time. The beach itself seemed wilder, more untamed, yet dotted with advanced technology that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. Eric and Maria slowly opened their eyes, gazing in wonder at the transformed world around them. What happened?" Maria breathed, her scientific mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Eric shook his head, equally amazed. It's as if our worlds have merged. As they looked around, they saw that their group of allies had been transformed as well. Some wore a mix of modern and Viking clothing, while others seemed to shimmer slightly, as if not fully anchored in this new reality. A figure approached them, a woman who looked both ancient and ageless at the same time. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "You have done it," she said, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. "Your choice, Erik Thorson, and your love for this woman of science has rewritten the very fabric of time itself." Maria stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her awe. "But how is this possible? The paradox should have torn reality apart." The woman smiled. "In most cases, yes. But your love, your connection that spans across time, created a bridge. Instead of destroying, it has merged. The spirit of the Vikings lives on, blended with the advancements of your modern world." Erik looked out at this new world, a sense of excitement building within him. "So what happens now?" The woman gestured to the transformed landscape. "That, young ones, is up to you. This world is a blank slate, a perfect blend of past and present. What you do with it is your choice." As the woman faded away, Erik and Maria turned to each other, their eyes meeting in a gaze filled with love and wonder. "Are you ready for this?" Erik asked, a grin spreading across his face. Maria laughed, the sound full of joy and anticipation. "With you by my side? Always." Hand in hand, Erik and Maria stepped forward into this new world, a world that held the promise of adventure, discovery, and a love that had literally changed the course of history. As they walked, Erik's Viking spirit and Maria's scientific mind already began to envision the possibilities that lay before them. They had faced time itself and emerged victorious, their love creating a future neither of them could have imagined. The horizon stretched out before them, filled with endless potential. And as the sun began to set on this first day of their new life, Erik and Maria knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. The spirit of the Vikings lived on, not just in Erik, but in this merged world where the past and present danced in perfect harmony. And at the heart of it all stood Erik and Maria, their love a beacon that would guide them through whatever challenges this new world might hold. Sarah Johnson's fingers trembled as she carefully tore open the envelope containing her DNA test results. The 28-year-old accountant had always been curious about her family history, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the crisp paper and began to read. Her eyes widened as they scanned the information, her heartbeat quickening with each passing second. "No way," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet of her Minneapolis apartment. "This can't be right." She read the results again, then a third time, her mind struggling to process the information. According to the DNA analysis, a significant portion of her genetic makeup could be traced back to Scandinavian origins, specifically to Viking ancestors. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She had always thought of herself as just another Midwesterner with a mix of European heritage. But Vikings, the fierce Norse warriors she had learned about in history class? It seemed impossible. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, Sarah opened her laptop and began to search for information about Viking history and culture. As the hours ticked by, she found herself falling deeper and deeper into a world of longships, Norse mythology, and ancient Scandinavian customs. The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated her face as she pored over articles, historical accounts, and archaeological findings. She was particularly fascinated by the Viking expeditions, imagining her ancestors sailing across treacherous seas in search of new lands and adventures. Before she knew it, the first rays of sunlight were peeking through her curtains. Sarah glanced at the clock and gasped, realizing she had spent the entire night researching. She had completely lost track of time, but the wealth of information she had discovered made her feel more alive than she had in years. Rushing to get ready for work, Sarah's mind continued to buzz with newfound knowledge. As she hurried to the office, she couldn't help but see her surroundings in a new light. The city streets of Minneapolis seemed dull compared to the visions of fjords and ancient Norse settlements that now filled her imagination. At her desk, Sarah found it nearly impossible to focus on her usual tasks. The spreadsheets that once held her attention now seemed meaningless in comparison to the rich history she had uncovered. Her eyes glazed over as she stared at the computer screen, her mind wandering to distant shores and long-ago battles. "Sarah? Sarah." Her colleague's voice snapped her back to reality. "Oh, sorry, Mark, what was that?" Sarah blinked, trying to regain her focus. Mark raised an eyebrow. "I've been trying to get your attention for the past 5 minutes. Are you okay? You seem distracted today." Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just didn't get much sleep last night." As she turned back to her work, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The numbers and formulas that once brought her satisfaction now felt empty and unfulfilling. She longed to be anywhere but here, preferably on the deck of a longship, wind in her hair and the taste of salt on her lips. The workday dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. When it finally ended, Sarah felt a mix of relief and excitement. She had plans to meet her friends for dinner, and while part of her wanted nothing more than to return home and continue her research, she knew she needed to share her discovery with someone. At the restaurant, Sarah fidgeted nervously as she waited for the right moment to bring up her news. Her friends chatted about their day-to-day lives, discussing work drama and relationship woes. It all seemed so trivial now. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, Sarah took a deep breath and spoke up. "So I got my DNA test results back yesterday." Her friends turned to look at her, mild interest on their faces. "Oh yeah?" her friend Lisa asked. "Anything interesting?" Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You could say that. Apparently I'm part Viking." There was a moment of silence before her friends burst into laughter. Sarah's smile faltered as she realized they thought she was joking. "Good one, Sarah," her friend Tom chuckled. "What's next, you're related to Leif Erikson?" Sarah felt a flicker of annoyance. "I'm serious, guys. The test showed a significant percentage of Scandinavian DNA, specifically linked to Viking ancestry." Her friends' laughter died down as they realized she wasn't kidding. Lisa reached out and patted Sarah's hand. "That's interesting, I guess, but it doesn't really change anything, right? I mean, it was so long ago." Sarah pulled her hand away, feeling a growing divide between herself and her friends. They couldn't understand the profound impact this discovery had on her. To them, it was just a trivial piece of information, but to Sarah, it felt like she had unlocked the secret to her very existence. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and awkward conversation. Sarah's friends tried to steer the topic back to more familiar territory, but she found herself unable to engage. Her mind was still sailing on longships and exploring fjords. As soon as it was politely possible, Sarah made her excuses and left the restaurant. The cool night air felt refreshing after the stifling atmosphere inside. She walked home quickly, eager to return to her research. Back in her apartment, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Here, surrounded by the books and articles she had already accumulated, she didn't have to pretend that her discovery wasn't monumental. She didn't have to see the skepticism in her friends' eyes or hear the dismissive tone in their voices. Sarah's gaze fell on a map of Scandinavia she had printed out earlier. She walked over to it, her fingers tracing the coastlines of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Each fjord, each island held the possibility of connection to her ancestors. As her fingertips glided over the paper, Sarah felt a longing so intense it was almost painful. She wanted to walk the lands her Viking forebears had walked, to breathe the air they had breathed, to see the world through their eyes. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt a sense of belonging, of purpose. The map beneath her fingers was more than just paper and ink. It was a gateway to her past and, perhaps, to her future. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Could she visit these places, learn the languages, immerse herself in the culture that was apparently her birthright? The practical part of her brain reminded her of her job, her apartment, her life here in Minneapolis. But the newly awakened Viking spirit within her scoffed at these concerns. As she stood there, lost in thought, Sarah made a silent vow to herself. She would uncover the truth about her Viking heritage, no matter what it took. This was just the beginning of her journey, and though she didn't know where it would lead, she was certain of one thing: her life would never be the same again. With renewed determination, Sarah turned back to her computer. The night was still young, and there was so much more to learn. As she settled in for another long night of research, she felt a thrill of excitement. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, connected to something greater than herself. Sarah Johnson sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The travel website displayed a tempting array of flights to Oslo, Norway. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the options, each one representing a step towards her newfound heritage. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. Absolutely crazy. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something she had to do. The call of her Viking ancestry had become too strong to ignore. With a deep breath, she clicked on a flight departing in 2 weeks' time. As she filled in her details, Sarah's hands began to tremble. This was really happening. She was going to Norway, the land of her ancestors. The final page showed her the total cost, and she winced. It was a significant chunk of her savings, but she knew it would be worth it. Her finger hovered over the confirm booking button for a moment. Then, with a surge of determination that felt almost Viking-like, she clicked. "Done," she whispered, a mix of excitement and terror washing over her. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah threw herself into learning basic Norwegian phrases, researching must-visit historical sites, and poring over Norse mythology. Her apartment slowly filled with travel guides, Norse-inspired artwork, and even a small replica of Thor's hammer. The night before her departure, Sarah stood in her bedroom, staring at her packed suitcase. Reality was starting to set in, and doubts began to creep into her mind. Was she really doing this? Traveling halfway across the world because of a DNA test? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from her mother. "Don't forget, we're picking you up at 7 a.m. sharp for the airport. Love you, honey." Sarah's stomach clenched. She hadn't told her parents the real reason for her sudden trip to Norway. They thought it was just an extended vacation, a break from her accounting job. How could she explain that she felt called by the blood of Viking warriors? Morning came too quickly. Sarah's parents arrived right on time, her father helping to load her luggage into the car while her mother fussed over last-minute details. "Did you remember your passport? And enough warm clothes? I hear it can get quite chilly in Norway even in summer," her mother said, worry etched on her face. Sarah nodded, trying to keep her nerves in check. "Yes, Mom. I've got everything." The drive to the airport was filled with her parents' well-meaning advice and questions. Sarah answered on autopilot, her mind already across the ocean. As they approached the security checkpoint, the reality of her journey hit Sarah full force. She turned to her parents, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm going to miss you both so much," she said, her voice cracking. Her father pulled her into a tight hug. "We'll miss you too, sweetheart, but you'll have a great time. It's good to explore the world while you're young." Her mother joined the hug, her own eyes glistening. "Just be safe, okay? And call us as soon as you land." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As she pulled away, she saw the confusion in her parents' eyes. They couldn't understand why this trip seemed to mean so much to her, why she was reacting as if she was leaving for war rather than a vacation. "I love you both," Sarah managed to say. "I'll see you in a few weeks." With a final wave, she turned and walked through security, her heart heavy but her spirit soaring. She was on her way to discover her true self, even if her parents couldn't understand that yet. The flight was long, but Sarah hardly noticed the hours ticking by. As the plane cruised over the Atlantic, she found herself drifting off, lulled by the gentle hum of the engines. In her dreams, she stood on the deck of a magnificent longship, the wind whipping through her hair. Around her, fierce Viking warriors prepared for battle, their axes and swords glinting in the sunlight. The air was filled with the sound of war cries and the clash of steel on steel. Suddenly, the scene shifted. Sarah found herself in a great hall, reminiscent of the descriptions of Valhalla she had read about. At the head of the table sat Odin himself, his one eye fixed upon her. Thor, Freya, and other Norse gods surrounded her, their faces both welcoming and challenging. Odin raised his drinking horn in a toast. "Welcome, daughter of the North," his voice boomed. "You have heard our call. Now prove yourself worthy of your heritage." Sarah woke with a start, her heart pounding. The dream had felt so real, so vivid. She could almost taste the salt spray on her lips, feel the weight of a sword in her hand. A movement outside the plane window caught her attention. Leaning over, Sarah gasped as she caught her first glimpse of Norway's rugged coastline. Fjords cut deep into the land, their waters a deep, mysterious blue. Snow-capped mountains rose in the distance, their peaks disappearing into the clouds. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Oslo Airport. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position and your tray tables are stowed. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Sarah barely heard him, her eyes glued to the window. As the plane descended, she drank in every detail of the landscape below. This was the land of her ancestors, the home of the Vikings. And now, it was calling to her. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, jolting Sarah back to reality. As she gathered her belongings and made her way off the plane, a mix of emotions swirled within her. Excitement, nervousness, and an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Following the signs to baggage claim, Sarah found herself in a long corridor. At the end, a set of automatic doors opened onto Norwegian soil. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment she had been dreaming of for weeks. With a surge of courage, Sarah stepped forward. As her foot touched the ground, an inexplicable feeling washed over her. It was as if every cell in her body suddenly relaxed, recognizing this place as home. She stood there for a moment, letting the sensation wash over her. The air smelled different here, crisp, clean, with a hint of the sea. The sounds of the airport faded away, replaced by an almost supernatural silence. "Unskilled," a voice behind her said. "Excuse me." Sarah startled, realizing she was blocking the way. She moved aside, offering an apologetic smile to the man who had spoken. As she did, she noticed the subtle differences in the faces around her. The high cheekbones, the fair hair, the blue eyes. These were her people, whether they knew it or not. As she made her way to baggage claim, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a threshold. This wasn't just a vacation or a genealogical expedition. This was a homecoming, a return to a place her soul had never forgotten. Retrieving her luggage, Sarah headed towards the exit. The automatic doors slid open, revealing the bustling arrivals area. Families reunited, business people hurried past. Tourists consulted maps and guidebooks, and there in the midst of it all stood Sarah Johnson, part American, part Viking, and now finally home. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into her new adventure. The blood of the Vikings coursed through her veins, and the spirits of her ancestors seemed to whisper encouragement in her ear. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah knew she was ready to face them. As she hailed a taxi to take her to her hotel, Sarah couldn't help but smile. Her journey had only just begun, but already she felt more alive than she ever had before. Norway, the land of fjords, Vikings, and her own hidden history, stretched out before her, full of promise and adventure. "Til hotellet, takk," Sarah said to the taxi driver, her carefully practiced Norwegian sounding clumsy to her ears. But as the taxi pulled away from the curb, carrying her deeper into Oslo and closer to her destiny, Sarah knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Sarah stood before a weathered wooden door, her heart pounding in her chest. The small coastal village of Ålesund stretched out behind her, its colorful Art Nouveau buildings a stark contrast to the rugged landscape beyond. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead, and raised her hand to knock. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to echo in the crisp Norwegian air. Sarah waited, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. After what felt like an eternity, she heard shuffling from within the house. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes. This must be Ingrid, Sarah thought, her distant cousin whom she'd contacted after weeks of genealogical research. "Hey," Sarah said hesitantly, using one of the few Norwegian words she knew. "Er du Ingrid?" The old woman's brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Ja, jeg er Ingrid. Du må være Sarah?" Her voice was gravelly but kind. Sarah blinked, realizing she had already reached the limit of her Norwegian vocabulary. Yes, I'm Sarah. I mean, ja, jeg er Sarah." She stumbled over the unfamiliar words. Ingrid's face softened into a smile, and she stepped back, gesturing for Sarah to enter. Come in," she said, waving her arm. Sarah stepped into the cozy home, immediately enveloped by the scent of cinnamon and cardamom. The interior was a mix of traditional Norwegian decor and modern amenities, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. Ingrid led her to a small sitting room, motioning for Sarah to take a seat on a well-worn sofa. The older woman settled into an armchair across from her, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "So," Ingrid began in heavily accented English, "you come from America to find family, yeah?" Sarah nodded eagerly, relieved that her cousin knew some English. "Yes, that's right. I recently discovered my Viking ancestry and wanted to connect with my roots." Ingrid tilted her head, a confused expression crossing her face. Sarah realized she had spoken too quickly and used words that might be unfamiliar. "Sorry," she said, slowing down her speech. "I learn about Viking family. Want to know more?" Understanding dawned in Ingrid's eyes. "Ah, yeah. Vikings." She nodded enthusiastically. "Our family. Very old. Many generations here." Despite the simplicity of their communication, Sarah felt a surge of excitement. She was talking to someone who shared her bloodline, who could trace her ancestry back to the Viking age. Ingrid rose from her chair, motioning for Sarah to follow. Come, I show you something." Sarah trailed after her cousin as they moved to another room. Ingrid rummaged through an old trunk, eventually pulling out a leather-bound album. As she opened it, Sarah gasped. The pages were filled with black and white photographs, some so old, they were beginning to fade. "Family," Ingrid said simply, her eyes lighting up as she began to point out various figures in the photos. Sarah leaned in, captivated by the faces staring back at her. Men with strong jawlines and women with fierce eyes gazed out from the pages, their features not unlike her own. Ingrid's wrinkled finger landed on a photo of a stern-looking man with the impressive beard. "Min oldefar," Ingrid said. At Sarah's confused look, she added, "My great-grandfather." Sarah nodded, studying the man's face. She could see echoes of him in her own father's features, bridging the generations between them. As they flipped through the album, Ingrid began to speak more, telling stories about the people in the photos. Though Sarah couldn't understand most of the words, she found herself nodding along, captivated by the emotion in her cousin's voice. After what seemed like hours, Ingrid closed the album with a satisfied sigh. "Hungry?" she asked Sarah. "Yes, very," Sarah replied, suddenly aware of the growling in her stomach. Ingrid smiled and led the way to the kitchen. "I make traditionell Norsk mat," she said. At Sarah's puzzled look, she clarified, "Traditional Norwegian food." Sarah watched in fascination as Ingrid bustled around the kitchen preparing their meal. The older woman hummed to herself as she worked, occasionally explaining what she was doing in her limited English. Finally, they sat down to a feast of fårikål, mutton and cabbage stew, lefse, potato flatbread, and brunost, brown cheese. Sarah took a tentative bite of the fårikål and was immediately transported. The flavors were rich and comforting, unlike anything she'd tasted before, yet somehow familiar. As they ate, Sarah felt a deep connection to her ancestors. This was the food they had eaten, prepared in much the same way for countless generations. Each bite seemed to strengthen her ties to this land and its people. Ingrid watched her with a knowing smile. "Good, ja?" she asked. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Veldig god," she replied, using one of the phrases she'd learned, meaning, "very good." After dinner, they retired to the sitting room again. The language barrier was still present, but it seemed less daunting now. They managed to communicate through a combination of simple English, gestures, and the few Norwegian words Sarah knew. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself yawning. Ingrid noticed and showed her to the guest room, a small but comfortable space with a view of the fjord. "God Nat," Ingrid said, patting Sarah's arm. "God Nat," Sarah replied, smiling at her cousin. Once alone, Sarah quickly prepared for bed, exhausted from the day's emotions and the lingering effects of jet lag. She climbed under the cozy duvet, listening to the distant sound of waves lapping against the shore. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a sound caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as she listened more closely, she realized it sounded like whispers. The words were indistinct, in a language she didn't understand, yet they seemed oddly familiar. Sarah sat up in bed, straining her ears. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. They rose and fell like the tide, sometimes clear enough that she felt she could almost grasp their meaning, other times fading to near silence. A chill ran down her spine as she realized what she was hearing. It wasn't Norwegian or any modern language. No, these whispers were in an ancient tongue, the language of her Viking ancestors. Sarah pulled the duvet closer around her, both terrified and exhilarated. Was she imagining things? Had the excitement of the day and her intense connection to her ancestry caused her mind to play tricks on her? But as the whispers continued, growing slightly louder, Sarah knew this was real. Somehow, impossibly, she was hearing the voices of her ancestors. They spoke of battles and voyages, of harsh winters and bountiful harvests. Though she couldn't understand the words, their meaning seemed to seep into her very bones. Sarah sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the ancient whispers. They filled her with a sense of belonging, of coming home to a place she'd never known. At the same time, they hinted at mysteries yet to be uncovered, adventures yet to be had. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, the whispers finally faded away. Sarah lay back down, her mind reeling from the experience. She knew that whatever happened next, her life had been irrevocably changed. She had come to Norway seeking her roots, and she had found so much more. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of the guest room, gently rousing Sarah from her slumber. The events of the previous night, the whispers in an ancient tongue, still lingered in her mind, leaving her feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. As she made her way downstairs, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cardamom-spiced pastries filled the air. "God morgen, Sarah." Ingrid greeted her with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to mention the mysterious whispers. Deciding against it, she simply nodded. "Yes, thank you. The room is very comfortable." They shared a quiet breakfast, the language barrier still present but somehow less daunting in the light of day. As they finished their meal, Ingrid's expression suddenly turned serious. "Sarah," she began, her voice low and solemn, "there is something I must show you." Intrigued, Sarah followed her elderly cousin to a small study off the main living area. The room was filled with books, old maps, and various artifacts that spoke of the family's long history. Ingrid moved to an ornate wooden chest in the corner, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly as she opened it. From within, she withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This," Ingrid said, her voice barely above a whisper. has been in our family for many generations. It is said to have belonged to our Viking ancestors. Sarah's heart began to race as Ingrid carefully opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her palm. There, gleaming in the soft light, was an intricate Viking pendant. The piece was made of what appeared to be silver, its surface etched with complex knotwork and runes. At its center sat a deep blue stone that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, unable to take her eyes off the pendant. Ingrid nodded solemnly. "It has been passed down through the generations, always to the one who showed the strongest connection to our Viking heritage." She paused, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "I believe it is time for you to have it." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But Ingrid, I've only just discovered my Viking ancestry. Surely there must be someone else in the family who—" Ingrid shook her head, cutting off Sarah's protests. "No, Sarah. The pendant chooses its keeper, and it has chosen you." With trembling hands, Sarah accepted the pendant from Ingrid. As she held it, she could have sworn she felt a faint pulse, like a heartbeat, emanating from the jewelry. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to put it on. Ingrid nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. Sarah unclasped the chain and carefully placed it around her neck. As the pendant settled against her skin, a strange warmth began to spread through her body. It started at her chest where the pendant rested and quickly radiated outward to her fingertips and toes. "Oh," Sarah gasped, her hand flying to the pendant. "You feel it, don't you?" Ingrid asked, her voice filled with a mix of awe and satisfaction. "The power of our ancestors." Sarah nodded, unable to find words to describe the sensation. It was as if every cell in her body had suddenly awakened, humming with an energy she had never known before. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah found herself constantly touching the pendant, drawing comfort from its solid presence against her skin. Ingrid shared more family stories, but Sarah found it hard to concentrate, her mind continually drawn back to the mysterious artifact now in her possession. As night fell, Sarah retired to her room, her mind swirling with questions about the pendant and its significance. She changed into her nightclothes, hesitating for a moment before deciding to leave the pendant on. Somehow the thought of taking it off felt wrong. Sarah climbed into bed, her fingers absently tracing the intricate patterns on the pendant's surface. Despite the day's excitement, she found herself drifting off to sleep almost immediately. But her sleep was far from peaceful. Vivid dreams flashed behind her eyelids, each more intense than the last. She saw longships cutting through stormy seas, their dragon-headed prows rising and falling with the waves. She felt the weight of an axe in her hand, heard the clash of steel on steel as warriors met in battle. In her dreams, Sarah walked through ancient Norse villages, smelled the smoke from cooking fires and heard the laughter of children playing. She stood in great mead halls, listening to skalds recite epic poems of gods and heroes. She felt the biting cold of Nordic winters and the sweet relief of short, intense summers. Throughout it all, the pendant felt warm against her skin, almost as if it were alive. It seemed to pulse in time with the rhythm of her dreams, guiding her through this visionary journey into her ancestral past. Suddenly, Sarah found herself standing on the prow of a longship. The wind whipped through her hair, carrying with it the salty tang of the sea. Ahead, shrouded in mist, she could just make out the coastline of an unknown land. A sense of excitement and trepidation filled her, mirroring what her ancestors must have felt as they approached new shores. A voice called out behind her, speaking in that ancient tongue she had heard in the whispers. Though she couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear. "Land ho." With a start, Sarah's eyes flew open. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, her breath coming in short gasps. The room was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she noticed a faint glow. Looking down, she realized with a mixture of awe and fear that the source of the light was the pendant itself. The blue stone at its center pulsed with a soft, ethereal light that seemed to beat in time with her own racing heart. Sarah cupped the pendant in her hands, feeling its warmth against her palms. As she watched, the glow slowly faded, leaving her once again in darkness. For a long moment, Sarah sat there, trying to process what had just happened. The dreams had felt so real, so vivid. It was as if she had truly lived those moments, experienced the life of her Viking ancestors firsthand. Shaking her head in disbelief, Sarah rose from the bed and made her way to the small mirror hanging on the wall. She switched on the bedside lamp, its warm glow filling the room. As she gazed at her reflection, Sarah gasped. The woman staring back at her seemed somehow different from the one who had arrived in Norway just days ago. Her posture was straighter, her shoulders set with a new confidence. But it was her eyes that truly caught her attention. Where before there had been uncertainty and a hint of fear, now Sarah saw a fierce determination burning in her gaze. It was the look of someone who had discovered their true purpose, who was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The pendant hung at her throat, its intricate designs catching the light. As Sarah touched it, she felt that now familiar warmth spread through her body. But this time it brought with it a sense of clarity and purpose. In that moment, Sarah knew that her journey was far from over. The pendant and the dreams it had brought were just the beginning. There were more secrets to uncover, more connections to her Viking heritage to explore. As she stood there, meeting her own determined gaze in the mirror, Sarah made a silent vow. She would unravel the mysteries of the pendant and her ancestry, no matter where that path might lead her. The blood of Vikings ran in her veins, and she was ready to embrace that legacy fully. With newfound resolve, Sarah returned to bed. As she drifted back to sleep, her hand resting protectively over the pendant, she felt a sense of anticipation. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew she was ready to face it with the strength and courage of her Viking ancestors. The pendant pulsed once more against her skin, a silent acknowledgement of her determination. And as Sarah fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the whispers of her ancestors seemed to echo once more in the quiet room, welcoming her into their ancient and noble lineage. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Sarah set out on her hike through the fjords. The pendant hung heavy around her neck, a constant reminder of the connection she'd forged with her Viking heritage. The rugged landscape stretched out before her, a testament to the harsh beauty that had shaped her ancestors' lives. As she climbed higher, the fjord's waters glittering far below, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the raw majesty of her surroundings. She paused to catch her breath, her hand instinctively moving to touch the pendant. The moment her fingers made contact with the cool metal, the world around her began to shift and blur. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and Sarah closed her eyes, struggling to maintain her balance. When she opened them again, she gasped in shock. Gone were the hiking trails and modern gear. Instead, she found herself standing in the midst of a bustling 9th-century Viking village. "Impossible," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. Wooden longhouses with thatched roofs lined a central pathway. Men and women in rough-spun clothing moved purposefully about their tasks. The air was filled with the sounds of hammering, the bleating of goats, and the chatter of a language she couldn't understand but somehow felt familiar. As Sarah stood there, frozen in disbelief, a burly man with a thick red beard strode past her, calling out in that ancient tongue. His words seemed to galvanize the village into action. Men began to gather weapons, axes, swords, and round wooden shields, while women hurried to pack provisions. With a start, Sarah realized what she was witnessing. These were her ancestors, preparing for a raid. She watched in awe as the excitement built among the villagers. Young men boasted of the glory they would win, while seasoned warriors checked their equipment with grim determination. Women embraced their husbands and sons, their faces a mix of pride and worry. A tall, broad-shouldered man, who seemed to be the leader, raised his voice addressing the gathered warriors. Though Sarah couldn't understand his words, the intent was clear. This was a rallying cry, a call to adventure and glory. As the men cheered in response, Sarah felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of her was thrilled by the raw energy and bravery on display. Another part recoiled at the violence she knew would follow. Before she could process these feelings, the scene around her began to shift once more. The village faded away, replaced by the creaking timbers of a longship. Sarah found herself standing amidst a crowd of warriors, the open sea stretching out in all directions. The salt spray stung her face as the ship rose and fell with the waves. All around her, men worked the oars or adjusted the sail, their movements synchronized and efficient. At the prow, a lookout scanned the horizon, searching for land or enemy ships. Sarah's heart raced with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was what it felt like to be a Viking, setting out into the unknown in search of wealth and glory. The thrill of adventure was palpable, hanging in the air like a physical presence. A young warrior near her, barely more than a boy, turned and spoke. Though she couldn't understand his words, his expression of nervous excitement needed no translation. Sarah felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness towards him, wondering if he might be a distant ancestor. Suddenly, a shout went up from the lookout. Sarah's gaze snapped to the horizon, where she could just make out the silhouette of another ship. The atmosphere on the longship instantly changed, tension replacing excitement as the warriors prepared for battle. The scene shifted again, and Sarah found herself in the midst of chaos. The clash of steel on steel filled the air, punctuated by war cries and screams of pain. Warriors from both sides fought fiercely, their faces contorted with effort and rage. Sarah watched in horror as men fell on both sides, their blood staining the deck of the ship. She saw acts of incredible bravery and terrible brutality. The young warrior she had noticed earlier fought valiantly, but was eventually struck down, his eyes wide with shock as he fell. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she witnessed the harsh realities of Viking life unfold before her. This was no sanitized Hollywood version of history, but the raw, unfiltered truth of her ancestors' existence. The vision changed once more, and Sarah found herself back on land. But this was no triumphant return. She stood in the village she had seen earlier, but now it was a scene of mourning. Women wailed over the bodies of fallen warriors, while children looked on with confused, tear-stained faces. Yet even in the midst of grief, Sarah saw signs of resilience. The survivors helped each other, sharing food and comfort. Plans were already being made to repair damaged buildings and replace lost livestock. Life would go on, as it always had. An old woman, her face etched with the lines of a hard life, approached a group of young children. She began to speak, her voice rising and falling in what Sarah realized must be the recitation of a saga. Even in their grief, the Vikings were preserving their history, passing on the tales of their fallen heroes to the next generation. As Sarah listened, mesmerized by the cadence of the old woman's voice, she felt the pendant grow warm against her skin. The world around her began to fade, the voices growing distant. With a gasp, Sarah found herself back in the present, standing on the hiking trail overlooking the fjord. Her legs trembled, and she sank to her knees, overwhelmed by what she had experienced. For several long moments, she simply sat there, tears flowing freely as she processed the raw emotions of her ancestors' experiences. The thrill of adventure, the terror of battle, the agony of loss, the strength to endure, all of it swirled within her, as real as if she had lived it herself. When she finally stood, Sarah knew she was forever changed. The Viking blood that flowed through her veins was more than just a genetic marker. It was a living legacy of courage, resilience, and the unquenchable human spirit. She touched the pendant gently, whispering a thanks to whatever power had granted her this incredible vision. As she did so, she caught her reflection in a small pool of water left by recent rains. The face that looked back at her was transformed. Her eyes held a new depth, as if the wisdom of centuries had been granted to her in those brief moments. The set of her jaw spoke of a newfound determination, a strength forged in the crucible of her ancestors' experiences. Sarah took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp Norwegian air. She felt more alive than she ever had before, more connected to this land and to her own identity. As she resumed her hike, her steps were surer, her posture straighter. The pendant hung at her throat, a comforting weight that seemed to pulse with the beat of her heart. Sarah knew that her journey was far from over. In fact, it felt as if it had only just begun. The raw emotions of her vision stayed with her, a bittersweet mix of pride, sorrow, and awe. She had witnessed the full spectrum of Viking life, the glory and the tragedy, the adventure and the hardship. And in doing so, she had discovered a well of strength within herself that she never knew existed. As the sun began to set, painting the fjord in hues of gold and pink, Sarah made her way back to Ingrid's house. She knew she would never be able to fully explain what she had experienced, but she also knew she didn't need to. The knowing look in Ingrid's eyes told her that her elderly cousin understood more than she let on. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her hand resting on the pendant, she felt a profound sense of peace. The voices of her ancestors seemed to whisper in the darkness, no longer foreign and mysterious, but familiar and comforting. She was part of something greater than herself, a long line of strong, brave individuals who had faced unimaginable challenges and endured. With that thought, Sarah drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with long ships and fjords, battles and feasts, loss and triumph. The Viking blood in her veins sang with the stories of 1,000 years, and Sarah knew that somehow, someday, she would find a way to honor that legacy. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Sarah found herself standing in a muddy field on the outskirts of Ålesund. Around her, a group of men and women dressed in rough spun tunics and leather armor were stretching and chatting animatedly. This was the local Viking reenactment group, and today was Sarah's first day of training. After her vivid vision in the fjords, Sarah had felt an overwhelming urge to connect more deeply with her Viking heritage. When she'd stumbled across a flyer for the reenactment group, it had felt like fate. Now, as she watched the others prepare for the day's activities, a mix of excitement and nervousness churned in her stomach. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard approached her, a friendly smile on his face. "You must be Sarah," he said in heavily accented English. "I'm Eric, the group leader. Welcome to Ålesund Viking Lag." Sarah returned his smile, grateful for the warm welcome. "Thank you, Eric. I'm really excited to be here." Eric nodded approvingly. "Good. You'll need that enthusiasm. Viking combat training is not for the faint of heart." He turned to address the group. "All right, warriors. Let's begin with basic sword drills." As the training session progressed, Sarah quickly realized that Eric hadn't been exaggerating. The wooden practice sword felt awkward and heavy in her hands, and her arms ached from the repetitive motions of basic strikes and blocks. Sweat dripped down her back, and her muscles screamed in protest. "Keep your guard up, Sarah," Eric called out as he passed by. "A lowered shield means certain death on the battlefield." Gritting her teeth, Sarah raised her shield higher, ignoring the burning in her shoulder. She thought of her ancestors, of the battles they had fought and the hardships they had endured. If they could survive real combat, surely she could handle a few hours of practice. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself looking forward to the grueling training sessions. Her body, once soft from years behind a desk, began to change. Muscles she never knew she had became defined, and her endurance improved dramatically. The pendant around her neck seemed to pulse with approval, growing warm against her skin during particularly intense workouts. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the training grounds, Eric pulled her aside. "You're making good progress," he said, his eyes twinkling with approval. "I think you're ready for your first mock battle." Sarah's heart leapt with excitement. "Really? You think I'm ready?" Eric nodded. "You have the skills. Now it's time to see how you perform under pressure." The day of the mock battle dawned bright and clear. Sarah stood with her fellow reenactors, all of them decked out in full Viking gear. The weight of her armor felt comforting, like a second skin. As she gripped her practice sword and shield, a strange calm settled over her. Eric's voice rang out across the field. "Remember, this is just a simulation, no real injuries, but fight with honor and give it your all." With a mighty war cry, the two groups charged at each other. Sarah's world narrowed to the clash of wood on wood, the thud of bodies colliding, the grunts and shouts of her comrades and opponents. To her surprise, Sarah found herself moving with a fluidity and grace she'd never experienced before. It was as if her body knew exactly what to do, guided by some ancient instinct. She parried blows, struck back with precision, and maneuvered through the chaotic melee with surprising ease. "Watch your left, Sarah," a voice called out. She spun just in time to block a strike from an opponent who had tried to flank her. Without thinking, she countered with a swift strike to his midsection, killing him according to the rules of engagement. As the battle raged on, Sarah lost herself in the rhythm of combat. The pendant at her throat burned hot, and for a moment, she could have sworn she heard the clash of real steel and the roar of the sea. When Eric finally called an end to the simulation, Sarah was breathless, exhilarated, and filled with a sense of pride she'd never known before. "Well done, Shield Maiden," Eric said, clapping her on the shoulder. "You fought like a true Viking today." Sarah beamed at the praise, her chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, Eric. It felt natural somehow." That evening, as Sarah sat in her room at Ingrid's house, she found herself unable to shake the lingering excitement from the day's activities. On an impulse, she decided to start a project she'd been considering for weeks. Gathering the materials she'd been slowly collecting, wood, leather, paint, and metal studs, Sarah began to craft her own Viking shield. As she worked, carefully following the traditional methods she'd researched, she felt a deep connection to her ancestors. She imagined a Viking craftsman from centuries ago, perhaps one of her own forebears, creating a shield much like this one. Would he have felt the same sense of purpose, the same pride in his work? As she painted intricate designs on the shield's face, Sarah found herself humming an old Norse tune she'd learned during reenactment gatherings. Days turned into weeks as Sarah continued her training and worked on her shield in the evenings. Her skills in both combat and craftsmanship improved steadily. The pendant seemed to grow warmer and pulse more strongly with each passing day, as if approving of her dedication. Finally, after weeks of hard work, Sarah's shield was complete. She held it up, admiring the intricate knotwork designs and the sturdy construction. It was more than just a prop for reenactments. It was a tangible connection to her heritage, a symbol of the warrior spirit she'd discovered within herself. The next day, Sarah arrived at the training grounds early. She had donned her full Viking garb, the rough-spun tunic, the leather armor, the fur-lined cloak. Her hair was braided in the traditional style, and the pendant hung proudly at her throat. In her hand, she carried her newly completed shield. As she stood there, waiting for the others to arrive, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a nearby stream. The woman who looked back at her was a far cry from the uncertain tourist who had arrived in Norway weeks ago. Her posture was straight and confident, her muscles toned from weeks of training. The Viking clothing suited her, looking natural rather than like a costume. But it was her eyes that showed the most dramatic change. They blazed with a fierce determination, a look that would not have been out of place on the face of a shield maiden preparing for battle. For the first time, Sarah truly recognized the warrior spirit within herself. It wasn't just about the physical training or the historical knowledge she'd gained. It was a fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. She was Sarah Johnson, accountant from Minneapolis, but she was also a descendant of Vikings, carrying the blood of warriors in her veins. The pendant at her throat pulsed warmly, as if in agreement. As the other reenactors began to arrive, many of them pausing to admire Sarah's new shield, she stood tall and proud. She was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, be they in the mock battles of the reenactment group or in her quest to uncover more about her Viking heritage. Eric approached, a broad smile on his face as he took in Sarah's appearance and her new shield. "You look like a true Viking warrior, Sarah," he said approvingly. "Are you ready for today's training?" Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on her shield. "I'm ready," she said, her voice filled with determination. "For this and for whatever comes next." As she moved to join her fellow reenactors, Sarah felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. She had embraced the warrior within, honoring the legacy of her ancestors while forging her own path. Whatever adventures lay ahead, she would face them with the courage and strength of a true Viking. The cool, damp air of the ancient burial mound enveloped Sarah as she carefully made her way through the narrow passage. Her flashlight beam danced across rough-hewn stone walls, illuminating centuries-old carvings and the occasional glint of a long-forgotten offering. "Amazing," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. She had joined a local archaeological team for a survey of this recently discovered site, eager to connect more deeply with her Viking heritage. As she moved deeper into the mound, a sense of anticipation grew within her, as if something important was waiting to be found. Suddenly her foot caught on an uneven bit of floor, sending her stumbling forward. As she regained her balance, her flashlight beam fell upon something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, partially buried in the earthen floor, was a large, flat stone covered in intricate carvings. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what she was looking at. A runestone. "Professor Larson," she called out excitedly. "I found something." The lead archaeologist hurried over, his eyes widening as he saw Sarah's discovery. "Incredible," he murmured, kneeling down to examine the runestone more closely. "This could be a significant find." As the team carefully excavated the runestone, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the ancient runes carved into its surface. Something about them called to her, as if they held a message meant specifically for her eyes. Once the stone was fully unearthed and documented, Professor Larson turned to Sarah with a smile. "Would you like to try your hand at a preliminary translation? I know you've been studying Old Norse." Sarah nodded eagerly, her fingers already tracing the lines of the runes. As she began to work on deciphering the ancient script, she felt the pendant at her throat grow warm, almost as if it was encouraging her efforts. Hours passed, but Sarah barely noticed. She was completely absorbed in the runestone's riddle, jotting down possible translations and cross-referencing with her books on Old Norse language and mythology. As the sun began to set, Professor Larson gently interrupted her work. "Sarah, we need to close up the site for the night. You can continue your translation work tomorrow." Reluctantly, Sarah packed up her notes and followed the team out of the burial mound. But even as she made her way back to Ingrid's house, her mind was still focused on the mysterious runes. That night, Sarah's dreams were vivid and intense. She saw flashes of a great Viking longship, its dragon-headed prow cutting through stormy seas. She glimpsed a rocky island shrouded in mist, and a cave mouth hidden behind a cascading waterfall. And always, there was the glint of gold, the promise of a treasure beyond imagining. Sarah woke with a start, her heart pounding. The pendant at her throat pulsed warmly, as if confirming the importance of her dreams. Without hesitation, she reached for her notebook and began to scribble down everything she could remember. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into the task of deciphering the runestone's message. She pored over her notes, consulted every resource she could find, and spent long hours staring at rubbings and photographs of the stone. Ingrid watched her growing obsession with concern. One evening, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table surrounded by books and papers, her elderly cousin decided to speak up. "Sarah," Ingrid said gently, "perhaps it is time to take a break, yeah? You have barely eaten or slept in days." Sarah looked up, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "I can't stop now, Ingrid. I'm so close to figuring it out. These runes, they're trying to tell me something important. I can feel it." Ingrid frowned, moving to sit across from Sarah. "And what of your job back in America? Your family? You cannot stay in Norway forever chasing ancient riddles." "You don't understand," Sarah insisted, frustration creeping into her voice. "This is important. It's part of who I am, my heritage." "Your heritage is more than just old stones and buried treasures," Ingrid countered, her voice taking on a stern edge. "It is about family, about the connections between people. You are losing sight of that." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not losing sight of anything. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing things clearly. Why can't you support me in this?" Without waiting for a response, Sarah gathered her materials and retreated to her room, slamming the door behind her. As she leaned against the closed door, she felt a pang of regret for arguing with Ingrid. But the pull of the runestone's mystery was too strong to ignore. That night, Sarah's dreams were more intense than ever. She saw herself standing before a great stone door, covered in runes that matched those on the runestone. As she watched, the runes began to glow, rearranging themselves before her eyes. Sarah woke with a gasp, her mind racing. She grabbed her notebook and began to write furiously, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "That's it!" she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "It's not just a message, it's a map." As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Sarah rushed downstairs, her breakthrough too exciting to keep to herself. She found Ingrid in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "Ingrid, I'm sorry about last night," Sarah began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But I figured it out. The runestone, it's pointing to an island, a hidden Viking treasure hoard." Ingrid turned, her expression a mix of concern and resignation. "Sarah, please. This obsession is not healthy. Perhaps it is time for you to return home to your real life." Sarah felt a flicker of doubt but quickly pushed it aside. "This is real, Ingrid. I know it is. The pendant, my dreams, they're all leading me to this. I have to see it through." For a long moment, the two women stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Finally, Ingrid sighed. "I cannot stop you, Sarah, but please be careful. The past can be a dangerous thing to meddle with." Sarah nodded, relieved that Ingrid wasn't going to try to prevent her from following this lead. "I will be. Thank you for understanding." Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into planning her expedition to the island revealed in her translation. She pored over maps, consulted with local boat owners, and gathered supplies for what she knew could be a challenging journey. As she made her preparations, Sarah could feel the pendant growing warmer, its pulses more frequent. It was as if the ancient artifact was urging her forward, confirming that she was on the right path. Finally, the day of departure arrived. Sarah stood at the small harbor, her backpack filled with supplies, her hand clasping the pendant at her throat. The salty sea breeze whipped at her hair, carrying with it the promise of adventure. As she boarded the small boat that would take her to the remote island, Sarah's heart pounded with anticipation. This was it, the culmination of her journey, the key to unlocking the secrets of her Viking heritage. The island slowly came into view through the morning mist, its rocky shores and dense forests looking both inviting and forbidding. As the boat drew closer, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. This was the island from her dreams. "We're here," the boat captain called out, steering towards a small natural harbor. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The runestone's riddle had led her here to this remote spot in the Norwegian Sea. Whatever secrets the island held, whatever treasures might be hidden in its depths, she was determined to uncover them. As she stepped onto the rocky shore, the pendant at her throat pulsed strongly, almost as if in welcome. Sarah smiled, her earlier doubts fading away. She was exactly where she was meant to be, following in the footsteps of her Viking ancestors. With a sense of destiny fueling her steps, Sarah shouldered her pack and set off into the island's interior. The runestone's riddle had promised hidden treasures and ancient secrets. Now, it was up to her to unravel the final pieces of the puzzle. As she disappeared into the mist-shrouded forest, Sarah couldn't help but feel that she was on the verge of a discovery that would change her life forever. The Viking blood in her veins sang with excitement, urging her forward into the unknown. The small boat pitched and rolled as it battled against the angry waves of the Norwegian Sea. Sarah gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles white with effort, but her face set with determination. The salty spray stung her eyes, and the wind whipped her hair wildly, yet she remained steadfast. "We should turn back," the boat captain shouted over the roar of the storm. "These waters are too treacherous." Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, we're too close to give up now. My ancestors braved worse than this. We push on." The captain muttered something under his breath but nodded grimly, steering the vessel through the tumultuous waters. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the pendant pulse warmly against her skin. It seemed to lend her strength, reminding her of the Viking blood that flowed through her veins. After what felt like hours of struggle, the island finally came into view through the mist and rain. As they approached the rocky shore, the sea began to calm as if recognizing their right to be there. "This is as far as I go," the captain said as he maneuvered the boat as close to the shore as he dared. "I'll wait here for 2 days. If you're not back by then, I'm leaving without you." Sarah nodded, understanding the risk he was taking. "Thank you. I'll be back." With a deep breath, she jumped from the boat into the shallow water, her waterproof pack secure on her back. The cold shocked her system, but she pushed forward, wading through the surf until she reached the pebbly beach. As Sarah stood on the shore, catching her breath and surveying the dense forest before her, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was it. The island from her visions, the destination pointed to by the runestone's riddle. Whatever secrets it held, she was determined to uncover them. Drawing on the survival skills she had learned during her time with the reenactment group, Sarah began to make her way into the forest. The undergrowth was thick, and she had to use her small axe to clear a path in some places. "Thor, lend me your strength," she muttered, remembering the prayers her reenactment friends often invoked before difficult tasks. As she pushed deeper into the island's interior, Sarah faced a gauntlet of natural challenges. A sudden downpour left the ground treacherously slippery, forcing her to move with careful deliberation. She used her knowledge of plant life to avoid poisonous vegetation and find edible berries to supplement her supplies. At one point, she found her path blocked by a swift-moving stream, swollen with rainwater. Sarah paused, considering her options. Then, remembering a technique she'd learned, she searched for a fallen tree. Finding a suitable log, she used her axe and strength to maneuver it across the stream, creating a makeshift bridge. "Not bad for a former accountant," she said to herself with a grin as she carefully crossed. As the day wore on, Sarah's muscles ached and her clothes were soaked with sweat and rain, but her determination never wavered. The pendant at her throat seemed to grow warmer with each step, as if encouraging her onward. Finally, as the forest began to thin, Sarah found herself facing a sheer rock face. At first, she felt a surge of disappointment, thinking she had reached a dead end. But then she noticed something odd about the rock formation. Brushing away centuries of moss and vines, Sarah gasped. There, carved into the living rock, was an intricate design of interlocking runes. Her heart raced as she recognized some of the symbols from the runestone. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The entrance to the tomb." Her hands shaking with a mix of excitement and nerves, Sarah began to examine the runes more closely. She realized it was a complex locking mechanism, requiring the correct sequence of runes to be pressed to open the door. Drawing on her knowledge of Old Norse and the clues from the runestone, Sarah began to work out the puzzle. Each correct rune she pressed caused the carved stone to glow faintly, while incorrect choices remained dark. After several tense minutes of trial and error, Sarah input the final rune. There was a moment of silence, then a low rumbling sound. Slowly, a section of the rock face began to slide open, revealing a dark passage beyond. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She switched on her flashlight and stepped into the ancient tomb. The air inside was cool and stale, heavy with the weight of centuries. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed rough-hewn walls covered in intricate carvings depicting battles, sea voyages, and Norse gods. As she moved deeper into the tomb, Sarah's senses were on high alert. She remembered stories of ancient burial sites being protected by traps and other dangers. Her Viking instincts, honed by months of training and her strange connection to her ancestors, guided her steps. Suddenly, Sarah's foot caught on a raised stone. She heard a click, followed by a whooshing sound. Without thinking, she dove forward, rolling across the ground. A fraction of a second later, a series of sharp spikes shot out from the walls, right where she had been standing. "Too close," Sarah muttered, her heart pounding. She carefully got to her feet, now even more wary of her surroundings. As she continued down the corridor, Sarah encountered more traps. A pressure plate that nearly triggered a cave-in, a false floor that would have dropped her into a pit. Each time, her instincts and quick reflexes saved her. Finally, the passage opened up into a large circular chamber. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing walls covered in the most intricate runes and carvings she had seen yet. At the center of the chamber stood a large stone sarcophagus, its lid carved with the image of a fierce Viking warrior. But it was what stood before the sarcophagus that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. There, larger than life, stood a spectral figure. It was translucent, glowing with an otherworldly light, but Sarah could make out the details of its appearance. It wore the armor of a Viking chieftain, a great axe held in its hands. Its eyes, burning with an intense blue fire, were fixed directly on Sarah. "Who dares enter the resting place of Bjorn Ironside?" The figure's voice boomed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I am Sarah Johnson," she said, her voice only trembling slightly. "Descendant of Vikings, guided here by ancient runes and visions." The spectral guardian regarded her for a long moment. "Many have sought the treasures of this tomb," it said. "All have been found unworthy. What makes you different, Sarah Johnson?" Sarah's mind raced. She thought of everything she had been through, her journey of discovery, the connection she felt to her Viking heritage. With sudden clarity, she knew what she had to say. "I seek not treasure but understanding," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I have come to honor my ancestors, to learn from their strength and wisdom. The true wealth I seek is knowledge of who I am and where I come from." The guardian's fierce expression softened slightly. "Fine words," it said, "but words alone are not enough. To prove your worth, you must face a final test. Are you prepared?" Sarah's heart pounded, but she nodded firmly. "I am." The spectral figure raised its axe. "Then let us begin. Show me the courage of your Viking forebears, Sarah Johnson. Prove that their blood truly runs in your veins." As the guardian advanced, its axe glowing with ethereal energy, Sarah felt the pendant at her throat pulse strongly. Whatever this test entailed, she knew it would push her to her limits. But she was ready. She had come too far to falter now. Sarah stood breathless in the tomb's central chamber, her eyes wide with awe. The beam of her flashlight danced across piles of gold coins, intricate jewelry, ornate weapons, and other priceless artifacts. It was a Viking treasure hoard beyond her wildest dreams, the accumulated wealth of generations of Norse raiders and traders. "By the gods," she whispered, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. As she stepped further into the chamber, the magnitude of her discovery began to sink in. This wasn't just any treasure. This was her inheritance, the legacy of her Viking ancestors. The pendant at her throat pulsed warmly, as if confirming her right to be there. Sarah's hand reached out, almost of its own accord, towards a beautifully crafted golden arm ring. Its intricate knotwork design spoke of master craftsmanship, and she could almost imagine it adorning the arm of a proud Viking chieftain. Just as her fingers were about to touch the cool metal, she hesitated. A wave of uncertainty washed over her. This was a burial site, a sacred resting place for her ancestors. Did she have the right to disturb it, even if she was a descendant? "What am I doing?" Sarah muttered to herself, withdrawing her hand. She looked around the chamber again, this time noticing the care with which everything had been arranged. This wasn't just a pile of loot. It was a carefully prepared grave goods, meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. As Sarah grappled with her conflicting emotions, the pendant at her throat suddenly grew hot, almost painfully so. She gasped, clutching at it instinctively. The world around her began to blur and shift. Suddenly, Sarah found herself standing on a windswept cliff, overlooking a bustling modern city. She recognized it as Oslo, but it seemed different, more advanced somehow. She saw herself, older and dressed in expensive clothes, standing at the opening of a grand museum. A plaque on the building read, "Johnson Viking Heritage Museum." The vision Sarah spoke to a crowd of reporters. "With the discovery of the Ironside Hoard, we've revolutionized our understanding of Viking culture and trade networks. I'm proud to share this piece of history with the world." The scene shifted again. Now Sarah saw herself in a university lecture hall, teaching eager students about Norse history. Books with her name on the cover lined the walls, and a Nobel Prize sat on her desk. "By bringing the hoard to light," the vision Sarah said, "we've been able to decode previously mysterious runic inscriptions and fill in crucial gaps in our historical knowledge." Just as quickly as it had appeared, the vision faded. Sarah found herself back in the tomb, her head spinning. She understood what she had seen, a possible future if she chose to claim the treasure and share it with the world. Fame, fortune, academic recognition, it was all within her grasp. But before she could fully process this, the pendant grew hot again. Once more, the world around her blurred. This time, Sarah found herself in a small, cozy home. An older version of herself sat in a comfortable chair, surrounded by children and grandchildren. She was telling them a story, her eyes twinkling with secret knowledge. "And so," the vision Sarah said, "I stood in that ancient tomb, surrounded by more gold than you could imagine. But I knew that some things are worth more than treasure." The children leaned in, captivated. "What did you do, Grandma?" one of them asked. Vision Sarah smiled. "I honored our ancestors by respecting their wishes. The treasure remains where it was meant to be, guarding the secrets of our past." The scene changed again. Now Sarah saw herself leading a small group of people, descendants of Vikings like herself, in a private ceremony at a nondescript spot on a remote island. They were honoring their ancestors, maintaining a connection to their heritage that went beyond material wealth. As this second vision faded, Sarah found herself once again in the treasure chamber, her mind reeling from what she had seen. Two possible futures, both stemming from the choice she was about to make. Sarah sank to her knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the decision before her. On one hand, claiming the treasure could advance human knowledge, bring her personal success, and share her Viking heritage with the world. On the other, leaving it undisturbed would honor her ancestors' wishes and maintain a private, spiritual connection to her past. "Who am I to make this choice?" Sarah said aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber. "Am I truly worthy of this Viking legacy?" She thought back on her journey, the discovery of her heritage, the training with the reenactment group, deciphering the runestone, braving the dangers of the island and the tomb. She had proven her courage and determination, but was that enough? The pendant at her throat pulsed gently as if encouraging her to look deeper. Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on the connection she felt to this place, to her ancestors. In her mind's eye, she saw flashes of her Viking forebears. They were not just warriors and raiders, but also farmers, craftsmen, explorers, and storytellers. They had been complex people facing difficult choices of their own. Sarah realized that being worthy of her Viking legacy wasn't about claiming treasure or achieving fame. It was about embodying the spirit of her ancestors, their courage, their curiosity, their respect for tradition balanced with their drive to explore and discover. With this understanding came a moment of clarity. Sarah knew what she had to do. Standing up, she took a deep breath and addressed the chamber, her voice strong and clear. "I, Sarah Johnson, descendant of Vikings, have journeyed far to reach this place. I have faced trials and proven my courage. But the greatest test was not in reaching this chamber, but in what to do now that I'm here." She paused, looking around at the glittering hoard. "This treasure is a testament to the skill, bravery, and adventures of my ancestors. It is also a sacred trust, placed here to honor the dead and preserve our history. I choose to respect that trust." Sarah reached up and unclasped the pendant from around her neck. She held it for a moment, feeling its comforting warmth one last time. I leave this pendant here, as my own contribution to this hoard. May it stand as a bridge between past and present, a symbol of the enduring legacy of the Vikings. She carefully placed the pendant atop a pile of gold coins. As soon as it left her hand, she felt a subtle shift in the air, as if the spirits of her ancestors were sighing in approval. I will not remove anything from this chamber, Sarah continued, nor will I reveal its location to the world. But I vow to honor the spirit of my Viking heritage in my own life. I will cultivate the courage, curiosity, and respect for tradition that defined my ancestors. As she spoke these words, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She knew that she had made the right choice, one that honored both her past and her future. With a final look around the chamber, committing every detail to memory, Sarah turned to leave. As she did, she could have sworn she heard a faint whisper, like many voices speaking as one. Vel Gjort, daughter of Vikinger. Well done, daughter of Vikings. Sarah smiled, feeling a deep connection to her ancestors and a renewed sense of purpose. She had entered this tomb in search of treasure, but she was leaving with something far more valuable, a true understanding of her heritage and her place in the long line of Viking descendants. As she made her way back through the tomb, navigating its dangers with newfound confidence, Sarah began to plan. She would return to the modern world not with gold and jewels, but with knowledge, wisdom, and a strengthened sense of identity. She would find ways to honor and preserve her Viking heritage, while also forging her own path forward. The treasure would remain hidden, a secret she would carry in her heart. But the real treasure, the spirit of the Vikings, would live on through her actions and choices. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest inheritance of all. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Sarah emerged from the ancient tomb, squinting against the sudden brightness. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp morning air. Though she carried no physical treasure, Sarah felt richer than she ever had before. As she made her way down the rocky slope towards the beach where the boat captain waited, Sarah's mind swirled with everything she had experienced. The weight of her decision still pressed upon her, but she felt a sense of peace that confirmed she had made the right choice. The boat ride back to the mainland was quieter than the journey out. The captain, noticing Sarah's contemplative mood, respectfully kept his questions to himself. As they approached the harbor, he finally broke the silence. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, his weathered face curious but kind. Sarah smiled, her eyes distant. "Yes and no," she replied. "I found something I didn't even know I was seeking." Back on solid ground, Sarah made her way to Ingrid's house. Her elderly cousin was waiting on the porch, worry etched across her face. When she saw Sarah, Ingrid rushed forward, enveloping her in a tight hug. "Tack og pris, thank goodness you're safe," Ingrid exclaimed. "I've been so worried." Sarah returned the hug, feeling a swell of affection for her cousin. "I'm sorry I worried you, Ingrid. I have so much to tell you." Over a pot of strong coffee and a plate of lefse, Sarah recounted her adventure. She told Ingrid about the treacherous journey to the island, the challenges she faced in the forest, and the ancient tomb with its spectral guardian. When she described the treasure chamber and her ultimate decision, Ingrid's eyes widened. "You left it all behind?" Ingrid asked, incredulous. Sarah nodded. "It was the right thing to do. Those artifacts belong to our ancestors, to history. But I gained something far more valuable." Ingrid reached across the table, squeezing Sarah's hand. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. You've shown wisdom beyond your years." As they talked late into the night, Sarah felt the bond between them grow stronger. Ingrid shared stories of their family history that she had never told before, filling in gaps in Sarah's understanding of her heritage. The next few days passed in a blur as Sarah prepared for her return to Minneapolis. She visited the archaeological team one last time, sharing what she could of her discoveries without revealing the location of the tomb. Professor Larson was disappointed that she hadn't brought back any artifacts, but he respected her decision. On her last day in Norway, Sarah rose before dawn. She packed a small bag with bread, cheese, and a bottle of mead, then set out for a nearby fjord. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, Sarah found a quiet spot overlooking the water. She laid out her simple offerings and knelt on the damp grass. Closing her eyes, Sarah began to speak, her voice soft but clear. Ancestors, I come before you today with a grateful heart. Thank you for guiding me on this journey, for showing me the strength that lies within me. I vow to honor your memory not through gold or glory, but through my actions and the life I choose to lead. Sarah poured a small amount of mead onto the ground as a libation, then raised the bottle in a toast. Skål, to those who came before, and to those who will come after. May your wisdom guide us always. As she completed her private ceremony, Sarah felt a sense of completion. She had forged a connection to her past that would help guide her future. The next morning, Sarah found herself on a plane bound for Minneapolis. As Norway disappeared beneath the clouds, she felt a momentary pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by excitement for what lay ahead. Sarah pulled out her journal and began to write, capturing her thoughts and feelings about the incredible journey she had undertaken. As the words flowed onto the page, she reflected on how much she had changed. She had arrived in Norway feeling lost, unsure of her place in the world. Now, she was returning home with a strong sense of identity and purpose. The Viking blood that flowed through her veins was no longer just a fun fact about her ancestry. It was a living, breathing part of who she was. But Sarah also recognized that she wasn't just a Viking. She was a modern woman, with dreams and ambitions that her ancestors could never have imagined. The challenge now was to find a way to honor both aspects of herself. As the plane began its descent into Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, Sarah closed her journal and looked out the window. The familiar landscape of her hometown spread out below her, but she saw it with new eyes. She thought about her job at the accounting firm, which had once felt so stifling. Now she saw it as an opportunity to apply the problem-solving skills and attention to detail that had helped her decipher the runestone. Perhaps she could find ways to make her work more fulfilling, or even explore new career paths that would allow her to share her passion for history. Sarah also thought about her friends and family, who had always supported her, but had never fully understood her fascination with her Viking heritage. She was excited to share her experiences with them, to help them understand the richness of their shared ancestry. As the plane touched down, Sarah felt a surge of energy. She was ready to forge her own legend, combining the spirit of a Viking with the heart of a modern woman. Stepping off the plane, Sarah took a deep breath. The air smelled of home, but it was tinged with the promise of new adventures. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, feeling the strength of her ancestors flowing through her. A group of her friends was waiting for her at the arrivals gate, holding a colorful "Welcome Home" sign. Sarah's face broke into a wide smile as she rushed to greet them. "Sarah, you look different," her best friend Emily said as they hugged. "Did something happen in Norway?" Sarah laughed, a rich, full sound that carried echoes of fjords and ancient sagas. "You have no idea," she replied, "but I can't wait to tell you all about it." As they walked towards the exit, Sarah's friends peppered her with questions about her trip. She answered them with enthusiasm, her eyes sparkling as she described the beauty of the Norwegian countryside and the warmth of the people she had met. But Sarah held back the full story of her adventure, saving it for a more private moment. Some experiences were too profound, too personal to share in the busy confines of an airport. As they stepped outside into the Minnesota sunshine, Sarah paused for a moment. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth on her face. In her mind, she saw flashes of the Norwegian landscape, the ancient tomb, the ghostly guardian. But when she opened her eyes, she was firmly in the present, surrounded by the sights and sounds of her hometown. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt perfectly balanced between her two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the Viking and the American. She was no longer torn between them, but rather enriched by both.